The cold came into the stones of Sainte Geneviève Abbey as if it had always been there, as if the mortar itself had been mixed with frost instead of water. In the year 1420, during the long January that sat heavy upon the countryside of northern France, the cold was not an event but a condition, a permanent state of being that had settled into the marrow of the world, and decided to stay for a very long visit. The snow had been falling for 3 days without any real conviction, not a storm with howling winds and dramatic drifts, but a steady, patient, almost bored descent of small white flakes that added layer upon layer to the ground, without anyone bothering to measure how deep it had become. It was simply deep enough that walking required lifting your feet a little higher, and the sound of footsteps changed from a scrape against stone to a soft crunch that was soon swallowed by the next falling flake. Inside the long stone building that housed the sick and the elderly of the Abbey's small community, the air held a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of wool rubbing against wool, as a sleepless monk shifted on his straw pallet, the quiet of a log settling deeper into the ash of the hearth with a sigh that was more felt than heard, and the quiet of breath moving slowly through the lungs of those whose bodies were too tired to do anything but rest. The infirmary was not a place of crisis on this particular evening. It was a place of waiting, a way station between the hard labor of summer and the uncertain arrival of spring. The long room with its low ceiling of dark beams smelled of dried rushes that had been sprinkled with a little rosemary water weeks ago, though the scent was now so faint you had to close your eyes and imagine it to be sure it was there at all. Beneath that, there was the older, more honest smell of cold stone that had been cold for so many centuries it no longer remembered what warmth felt like, and the faint, clean smell of the snow that sifted in through the cracks around the high, narrow windows and melted before it could reach the floor. Sister Clémence had been in the Abbey for 23 winters, and she had learned that the secret to surviving them was to move as little as possible while still doing what needed to be done. She was a woman whose age was difficult to determine because her face had settled into an expression of calm patience that could belong to a woman of 40 or a woman of 60 with equal plausibility. Her hands, however, told a clearer story. The knuckles were beginning to thicken from years of grinding herbs with a stone mortar, and the skin on her fingertips was permanently marked with small lines and stains from the handling of roots and barks and dried leaves. On this evening those hands were tucked deep into the opposing sleeves of her undyed wool habit as she stood in the doorway between the infirmary proper and the small chamber where she kept her few personal belongings. The door was not a door in the modern sense, but a heavy hanging of felted wool that had once been a dark brown but had faded over the years to the color of wet bark. She pushed it aside with her shoulder and stepped into her cell, a room that measured perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, and contained a wooden cot with a straw mattress, a small 3-legged stool, and a single shelf carved into the stone wall that held a clay cup and a small wooden cross, so old and handled that the features of the carved figure had been worn smooth and unrecognizable, leaving only the suggestion of a shape. She did not sit on the cot because she was not ready to sleep. The bells for Compline, the last prayer of the monastic day, had rung some time ago, and the great silence had fallen over the Abbey like a second blanket of snow. But Sister Clémence had a duty that pulled at her with a quiet insistence, a small thread of responsibility that tugged at the edge of her awareness and would not let her rest until she had seen to it. The infirmary garden. It was, in the strictest sense, not a duty that required her attention in the middle of a winter night. The garden was sleeping under more than a foot of snow, and nothing was growing. Nothing needed watering, nothing needed watering, nothing needed weeding, nothing needed harvesting. And yet, she knew she would not be able to close her eyes and let her breathing slow into the rhythm of sleep until she had walked down to the garden gate and stood for a moment in the cold, listening to the particular silence of a place where plants were waiting underground. It was a habit she had developed over the past 2 decades, a small ritual that had no name and no place in the rule of the order, but which had become as necessary to her as the recitation of the Psalms. She took her heavy wool cloak from the peg by the door and swung it around her shoulders, feeling the familiar weight settle against her back, like the embrace of an old friend who did not need to speak. The cloak smelled of lanolin, the natural oil in the sheep's wool that repelled the damp and kept the wearer dry in all but the heaviest downpour. combined with a faint trace of wood smoke from the kitchen fires that seemed to cling to every piece of fabric in the Abbey, regardless of how often it was aired. She pulled the hood up over her white linen wimple, the stiff fabric of the head covering crinkling softly as it adjusted to the new layer of weight, and she lifted the small iron key from the niche beside the door where it lived when it was not in her hand. The key was cold, cold in a way that felt personal and intentional, and she closed her fingers around it and felt the chill travel up through her palm and into her wrist before her own warmth began to push back against the invasion. The walk from her cell to the cloister walkway was a journey of only 40 or 50 steps, but in the darkness of a winter night in a stone abbey with no torches lit along the interior passages, those steps required a knowledge of the building that was stored not in the mind but in the feet. Sister Clémence knew that the third flagstone outside her door had a slight dip in its center, where centuries of footsteps had worn the granite smooth and concave, a small hollow that collected cold air and made that particular spot feel colder than the rest of the floor. She knew that the wall on her left would be interrupted by a wooden door frame after 12 paces, the door that led to the small still room where she prepared the herbal remedies and tisanes for the infirmary patients, and that she would need to step slightly to the right to avoid brushing her shoulder against the iron latch that protruded from the wood. She knew that after the still room door the passage opened into the cloister proper, a covered walkway that surrounded the central garth, the small square of open ground where the monks and nuns would sit and read during the warmer months, but which now lay under a smooth, unbroken expanse of white that glowed faintly with the reflected light of the hidden moon. The cloister arches were open to the garth on one side, and as she stepped into the walkway, the air changed. It became sharper, cleaner, and she could see her own breath appear before her face as a small cloud of white that lingered for a heartbeat and then dissolved into the darkness. The snow had stopped falling for the moment, leaving the world in a state of suspension between weathers. The clouds were still thick overhead, so there was no starlight and no direct moonlight, but the snow itself seemed to gather whatever faint illumination existed in the atmosphere and hold it close, radiating a soft, diffuse glow that made it possible to see the outlines of things without revealing their details. The pillars of the cloister arches were dark shapes against the lighter darkness of the snow beyond, and the roof of the walkway cast a shadow that cut across the white ground in a clean geometric line. Sister Clémence walked along the eastern side of the cloister, her soft leather shoes making almost no sound on the stone, her wooden pattens left behind in her cell because the garden path was covered in snow and the raised wooden soles would only make her stumble. The cold crept up from the stone through the thin soles of her shoes and wrapped itself around her ankles, a slow, patient cold that did not demand attention but simply made itself at home. She did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry because the garden was not going anywhere, and the faster she walked, the more cold air she would pull into her lungs, and the more her body would have to work to warm that air before it reached the delicate tissues inside her chest. So she walked at the pace of a woman who had nowhere to be except exactly where she was, a pace that matched the slow, heavy heartbeat of the winter night itself. The infirmary garden was not attached to the main cloister garth, but lay beyond it, through a small arched doorway in the north wall and along a short, covered passage that connected the main abbey buildings to the separate infirmary wing. This passage was darker than the cloister because it had no openings to the outside, only solid stone walls on both sides that held the cold and the darkness like a cup holds water. Sister Clémence trailed the fingers of her left hand along the wall as she walked, not because she needed the guidance, but because the touch of the stone, rough and granular under her fingertips, was a kind of conversation. The stone had been quarried from a site less than 10 miles away, brought here by ox carts and set in place by masons whose names were long forgotten, and it had stood here for more than 300 years, through winters colder than this one, and winters milder, through years of plenty and years of hunger, through the comings and goings of generations of men and women who had dedicated their lives to prayer and work and silence. The stone did not care about any of that, of course, but Sister Clémence found something reassuring in its indifference. The stone would still be here long after she was gone, holding up the roof and keeping out the wind, and the garden would still be here, and some other pair of hands would brush the snow from the rosemary and check the dampness of the soil under the straw. The passage ended at a heavy oak door, reinforced with iron straps, a door that led directly into the walled garden. This was the door that required the key. Sister Clémence took the key from the folds of her cloak where she had been warming it against her body, and she fitted into the large iron lock that was cold enough to make her fingers ache after only a few seconds of contact. The mechanism turned with a solid, satisfying clunk that sounded very loud in the muffled silence of the passage, a sound that seemed to echo off the stone walls and then be immediately absorbed by the snow beyond the door. She pushed the door open, and it swung inward on its heavy iron hinges without a sound, which was unusual, because the bottom edge of the door usually scraped against the stone threshold. She realized, with a small sense of something that was not quite surprise, but closer to a quiet acknowledgement, that the snow had drifted against the door from the outside, and was now acting as a cushion, lifting the door just enough to clear the stone. She stepped over the threshold and into the garden, and the door swung shut behind her with the same silent, snow-dampened motion. The garden in winter was a different place from the garden in summer, so different that it was sometimes difficult to believe they occupied the same patch of ground within the same stone walls. In summer, the garden was a riot of green and gold and purple, a place of buzzing bees and rustling leaves, and the sharp, clean scent of rosemary released by the heat of the sun. The paths were swept clean, and the beds were defined by low wattle edgings of woven willow branches, and the central sundial cast a shadow that moved across its stone face with a slowness that was almost imperceptible unless you looked away and then looked back. But in January of 1420, the garden was a study in white and grey, and the deep brown-black of wet bark. The wattle edgings were buried under the snow, their outlines visible only as gentle rises in the otherwise smooth surface. The sundial was a small hillock of white with a single protruding iron gnomon that pointed uselessly at a sky that had not shown the sun in days. The paths were gone, erased, replaced by an unbroken expanse of snow that connected everything to everything else in a single, seamless blanket. The walls that enclosed the garden on all four sides were visible only as darker shapes against the sky, their tops softened by a thick layer of snow that sat on the stones like a white cap. Sister Clémence stood just inside the gate and did not move. She let the cold settle around her, let her body adjust to the lower temperature, let her breathing slow until the clouds of vapor that appeared before her face came less frequently and with less force. She listened. The silence in the garden was not a complete absence of sound, because complete silence is very rare and, to the human ear, often unsettling. There was the faint, high-pitched whisper of the wind moving across the top of the snow, a sound so thin and delicate that she could only hear it if she turned her head slightly to the left and cupped her ear toward the open space. There was the occasional soft thump of snow sliding from a branch of the old quince tree in the corner, a sound that was more a sensation of pressure in the air than an actual noise, as if the snow was falling so gently that it disturbed nothing but the molecules of cold air that had been holding it in place. And beneath everything, there was the deep, absolute stillness of frozen earth, a stillness that was not empty but full, packed tight with the dormant life of roots and bulbs and seeds that was simply waiting. She knew the garden so well that she could walk its paths in complete darkness and know exactly where she was by the feel of the ground under her feet. Even with the snow smoothing out all the familiar landmarks, she knew that the bed of comfrey was to her left, about 5 paces from the gate, its broad hairy leaves long since died back to the ground, and its thick black roots holding fast in the frozen soil. She knew that the Bethany was just beyond the comfrey, a plant she valued for its gentle ability to ease headaches and calm the nerves of patients who had been too long in bed, and whose minds had begun to spin anxious circles in the absence of activity. She knew that the hyssop, with its woody stems and small, intensely aromatic leaves, was along the south wall where it could catch the most sun, though there was no sun to catch now and would not be for many weeks. And she knew that the lavender, the plant she loved most of all for its steadfast reliability and its clean, calming scent, was planted in a long row along the path that led to the stone bench, a bench that was now nothing more than a peculiar lump in the snow shaped like a loaf of bread, left out in the cold. She did not walk to any of these beds. She did not brush the snow away to check the condition of the straw mulch underneath. She did not kneel down to press her ear to the ground, as she sometimes did in the early spring, to see if she could hear the faint stirring of life beginning to move upward through the stems. She simply stood at the edge of the garden, her hands still tucked into her sleeves, her hood pulled forward so that the wool framed her face and kept the worst of the cold from her cheeks, and she let herself be present in the winter quiet. The 100 Years' War, that long and complicated conflict between the crowns of England and France, was being fought somewhere to the north and west of the Abbey, though the exact location of the armies shifted with the seasons and the fortunes of the commanders. News travelled slowly to Sainte-Geneviève, carried by travellers on the road or by the occasional messenger seeking shelter for the night. And the news was always old by the time it arrived, describing battles that had been fought weeks ago and treaties that had already been broken. The war had touched the Abbey only lightly, in the form of higher taxes on the lands the community owned, and a general sense of unease that hung over the countryside like the smoke from a distant fire. But inside the garden walls, the war did not exist. The war was a human thing, a thing of loud voices and sharp metal and the complicated hatreds of men who had never met each other. The garden knew nothing of war, knew only the turning of the seasons and the patient work of waiting for the soil to soften. Sister Clémence remained at the gate for a long time, long enough that the cold began to find its way through the layers of wool and linen and settle against her skin. She felt it first in her toes, which had been pressed against the thin leather of her shoes and were now beginning to lose their sharpness of sensation, becoming vague and distant as if they belonged to someone else, standing somewhere else. Then she felt it in her fingers, curled inside her sleeves, the tips growing numb and clumsy, and finally she felt it in the tip of her nose, which was the only part of her face exposed to the air beyond the shelter of her hood, and which had begun to ache with a dull, persistent throb that was not quite pain, but was certainly not comfort. She knew it was time to go back inside. The garden would still be here in the morning, and she would return then to do the small necessary tasks that kept the winter garden alive, checking the clay pots that protected the most delicate plants, making sure the straw mulch had not been disturbed by foraging animals, brushing the heavy snow from the branches of the young fruit trees so they would not break under the weight. But for now, she had done what she came to do. She had stood in the presence of the sleeping plants and acknowledged their waiting, and in doing so, she had acknowledged her own waiting as well. The long, slow, patient winter of the soul that every person who lived through the cold months had to endure. She turned back to the door, her movements slow and deliberate, so as not to disturb the silence that had wrapped itself around her like a second cloak. The key was still in the lock on the inside, and she turned it again, feeling the resistance of the cold metal and the satisfying finality of the bolt sliding home. She pushed the door open and stepped back into the dark passage, and the warmth of the enclosed space, though it was only a few degrees warmer than the garden, felt like stepping into a room where a small fire had been burning. She pulled the door closed behind her and heard the soft thump of the wood meeting the stone, a sound that marked the end of her small ritual and the beginning of the walk back to her cell. The passage was just as dark as it had been before, but her eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and she could make out the faint rectangle of lighter darkness at the far end where the passage opened into the cloister walkway. She walked toward it, her footsteps silent on the worn stone, and the cold that had settled into her bones began to retreat as her body generated its own small heat through the simple act of moving. Above her, under the snow that blanketed the roof and muffled every sound, the Abbey slept on, a small island of human habitation in a vast sea of winter, quiet, holding its breath and waiting for the slow, inevitable return of the light. And beneath the snow in the walled garden, the roots of the comfrey and the betony and the lavender held their own quiet counsel, knowing without knowing that the woman who tended them had come to visit, and that she would come again tomorrow, and that this was the way of things in the deep winter of the year 1420. The garden in the thin light of a January morning was a place of outlines and suggestions, a landscape reduced to its most basic shapes by the patient hand of winter. The snow that had fallen steadily for the better part of a week had not been a dramatic storm that sculpted the world into wild drifts and sweeping curves, but rather a quiet, persistent accumulation that filled in the low places and softened the high places until everything that had once been sharp and defined became gentle and rounded and indistinct. The stone walls that enclosed the infirmary garden on all four sides rose from the white expanse like the shoulders of some great sleeping beast, their tops capped with a thick layer of snow that sat so perfectly still it might have been carved from the same pale stone as the walls themselves, a trick of the cold that made the boundary between the man-made and the natural seem uncertain and unimportant. Sister Clémence had returned to the garden after the morning prayers of prime, when the first grey light of the day had begun to seep through the high windows of the chapel, and the community had risen from their knees to begin the slow, measured work of the winter hours. She had eaten a small piece of dark bread and drunk a cup of warm water from the kitchen, the water tasting faintly of the iron pot it had been heated in and of the wood smoke that flavoured everything in the Abbey during the cold months. Now she stood at the edge of the garden, just inside the heavy oak door, and she looked out across the white space with the careful attention of someone who knew that what was visible was only a small fraction of what was actually there. The garden under snow was like a book written in a language she had learned to read over many winters, a language of subtle rises and falls in the surface, of the way the morning light touched one area differently than another, of the small clues left by the wind and the weight of the snow itself. The central path that divided the garden into two roughly equal halves was completely invisible to anyone who did not already know it was there. In the summer months, this path was a strip of packed earth and crushed stone that ran from the gate at the north wall all the way to the stone bench against the south wall, a straight line that organized the garden and made it possible to walk among the beds without stepping on the plants. Now, in the deep of winter, the path was nothing more than a slightly lower area in the general surface of the snow, a shallow depression that was perhaps 3 feet wide and ran the length of the garden with a gentle, almost imperceptible dip. The snow had filled it first, of course, because it was lower than the raised beds on either side, but then the snow had continued to fall and had covered everything, and the difference in elevation was now so subtle that Sister Clémence could only trace the line of the path by the way the morning light, weak and grey as it was, fell across the surface. The light caught the very center of the path and made it appear just a shade darker than the areas to either side, a difference so small that she would not have noticed it if she had not spent 23 winters learning to see such things. The raised beds themselves were easier to identify once you knew what to look for. Each bed was a rectangle of earth that had been built up over many years by the addition of compost and well-rotted manure and the careful turning of the soil, and the edges of these rectangles were held in place by low wattle fences made from willow branches woven together in a simple over and under pattern. The wattle edging stood no more than 6 inches above the soil in the summer, just high enough to keep the earth from spilling onto the path and to give each bed a tidy, contained appearance. Under the snow, these woven edges created long, low ridges that ran around the perimeter of each bed, ridges that were softer and rounder than the sharp corners of the stone walls, but still distinct enough to trace with the eye. Sister Clémence could see the outline of the bed nearest the gate, the one she had planted with comfrey the previous spring, a rectangle perhaps 4 feet wide and 8 feet long, with a gentle hump in its center where the dormant crowns of the comfrey plants lay buried under the snow and the straw on the frozen soil. The wattle edge was visible as a continuous line of slightly darker snow, a shadow cast by the ridge onto the white surface that surrounded it, and she followed that line with her eyes around the entire perimeter of the bed, noting how the corners had been softened by the weight of the snow, and now appeared as gentle curves rather than the sharp angles she knew were there. The comfrey bed was the first of 6 beds that lined the eastern side of the central path, each one dedicated to a different medicinal plant or small group of plants that shared similar needs for light and water and soil. Beyond the comfrey, moving south toward the stone bench, was the bed of Bethany, a plant with dark green leaves and spikes of purple flowers that she harvested in the late summer and dried for use in teas that calmed the nerves and eased the tightness in the head that came from too many hours spent reading by candlelight. The Bethany bed was slightly wider than the comfrey bed because the plants tended to spread outward from their centers, sending out small runners that rooted in the soil and created new plants if she was not careful to trim them back. Under the snow, the Bethany bed appeared as a broader rectangle with a more pronounced central hump, the shape of the dormant plants creating a gentle mound that rose perhaps 8 inches above the level of the surrounding path. The wattle edge around this bed was barely visible at all, buried so deeply under the snow that only the faintest suggestion of a line remained, a ghost of a boundary that separated the planted earth from the unplanted path. Sister Clemence took a step forward, and then another, her soft leather shoes sinking into the snow with a quiet crunch that was the only sound in the garden besides the distant, muffled call of a crow somewhere beyond the Abbey walls. The snow came up past her ankles, and she could feel the cold seeping through the leather and the wool of her stockings, a slow, patient cold that wrapped itself around her feet and began to climb upward toward her calves. She did not mind the cold, or rather she had learned over many winters to accept it as a condition of being outside in January, something that could not be avoided, and so was not worth worrying about. She walked along the eastern side of the garden, staying close to the edge of the comfrey bed, where the snow was slightly shallower, because the raised earth of the bed itself had prevented the snow from drifting as deeply against the wattle edge. Her footsteps left a line of dark holes in the white surface, each one filling slowly with the fine dry snow that sifted down from the edges as she disturbed the crust. She stopped at the corner of the comfrey bed and knelt down, the wool of her habit pressing into the snow and beginning to soak up the moisture almost immediately. She did not hurry. There was no reason to hurry because the garden had nowhere to go, and neither did she, and the work of checking the straw mulch was a slow, methodical task that required patience and a gentle touch. She reached out with her bare right hand, the skin of her fingers already reddened and stiff from the cold, and she began to brush the snow away from a small area at the edge of the bed. The snow was light and dry, the kind of snow that falls when the temperature is well below freezing and the flakes are small and separate, and it moved easily under her hand, sliding away to reveal the darker surface of the straw mulch beneath. The straw had been laid down in late autumn after the first hard frost had killed back the tender tops of the comfrey and the plants had retreated into their roots for the long sleep of winter. She had spread it thickly over the entire bed, a blanket of pale gold that was meant to protect the dormant crowns from the worst of the cold and to prevent the soil from freezing and thawing and freezing again. A cycle that could heave the roots out of the ground and expose them to the killing air. The straw that she uncovered was a different color now than it had been in November. The pale gold had darkened to a wet brown, the color of fallen leaves that have lain on the ground through the first weeks of winter and begun the slow process of returning to the soil. The individual stalks of straw were still recognizable, long hollow tubes of dried grass that had been cut in the Abbey's own fields the previous summer, and bound into sheaves and stored in the barn until they were needed. Now they lay pressed flat by the weight of the snow, clumped together in small mats where the moisture had frozen them into solid sheets. Sister Clemence picked up a small handful of the straw and held it close to her face, breathing in the smell of it. The scent was faint in the cold air, because cold air holds smells tightly and does not release them easily. But she could detect the dry, dusty odor of old vegetation and the clean, sharp scent of the frost that had formed between the stalks. It was not an unpleasant smell, merely a quiet one, a smell that belonged to winter and to waiting and to the slow, patient work of decay that would eventually turn the straw into soil for next year's plants. She set the straw aside carefully, laying it on top of the snow beside the small hole she had made, and she looked at the soil that was now exposed. The soil of the comfrey bed was dark and heavy, a rich loam that the Abbey's gardeners had been improving for generations with compost from the kitchen scraps and manure from the small stable where the community kept a single draft horse and a few sheep. In the summer, this soil was loose and crumbly under her fingers, full of worms and tiny crawling things that she did not know the names of but understood were part of the living web that made the plants grow. Now, in the deep cold of January, the soil was frozen solid, as hard as the stone of the Abbey walls and almost as unyielding. She pressed the tip of her finger against the exposed surface and felt nothing give, only a cold, hard resistance that traveled up through her finger and into her hand. The soil was locked in ice, every particle of it held fast in a grip that would not loosen for many weeks yet, and the comfrey roots that threaded through that frozen earth were themselves frozen, their living tissues suspended in a state that was not quite life and not quite death, but something in between, a deep dormancy from which they would wake when the soil warmed and the days lengthened and the slow chemistry of spring began its work. She sat back on her heels and looked at the small hole she had made in the snow, a dark spot in the white surface that revealed the hidden world beneath. The straw mulch was doing its job, she could see that clearly enough. The soil beneath the straw was frozen, but it was frozen solid and still, without the cracks and fissures that would appear if the ground had frozen and thawed repeatedly. The straw had kept the temperature of the soil steady, preventing the warmth of the occasional sunny day from penetrating deep enough to wake the roots before the true spring had arrived. It was a simple thing, this blanket of dried grass, but it was the difference between a comfrey plant that survived the winter and one that heaved itself out of the ground and died. Sister Clemence had learned this lesson early in her years as the infirmary gardener, when she had lost an entire bed of valuable plants to a late winter thaw followed by a hard freeze, and she had never forgotten the sight of the roots exposed to the air, pale and shriveled and dead. She stood up slowly, her knees protesting the cold and the damp that had soaked through the wool of her habit, and she moved on to the Bethany bed. The process was the same. A slow, careful brushing away of the snow, an examination of the straw beneath, a brief check of the frozen soil, and then the replacement of the straw and the snow in something close to their original positions. The Bethany bed was in good condition, the straw thick and undisturbed, the soil beneath it frozen hard and steady. She noted with satisfaction that the wattle edging was still intact, the woven willow branches holding their shape despite the weight of the snow and the pressure of the frozen earth expanding outward. The willow was cut fresh each spring from the trees that grew along the small stream at the edge of the Abbey's land, and it was flexible and strong when it was first woven. But after a year in the garden it became brittle and dry, and the wattle fences had to be repaired or replaced each spring. This one had held up well, and she made a mental note to check it again when the snow melted, to see which sections could be saved and which would need to be rewoven. The third bed along the eastern side was planted with hyssop, a woody perennial that grew into a small shrub about 2 feet high and produced spikes of intensely blue flowers that the bees loved with a passion that was almost alarming. The hyssop was one of the hardiest plants in the garden, able to withstand cold that would kill more tender herbs, and Sister Clemence did not worry about it surviving the winter. What she was interested in this morning was the appearance of the dead stalks that rose above the snow, the remnants of last summer's growth that she had left standing in the autumn because they provided a bit of structure for the snow to catch on, and because she liked the way they looked, brown and brittle and stark against the white of the winter garden. The stalks were about 18 inches tall, woody at the base and thinner and more flexible toward the top, and they were covered with a delicate filigree of ice crystals that had formed during the cold nights when the moisture in the air froze directly onto any surface it touched. She stopped at the edge of the hyssop bed and looked closely at one of the stalks, bending forward so that her face was only a few inches from the ice. The crystals were tiny and intricate, each one a small feather of frozen water that had grown outward from the rough surface of the dead plant stem. They caught the weak morning light and scattered it into a faint shimmer that was almost too subtle to see, a glint of brightness that appeared and disappeared as she shifted her head. The ice had formed in layers. She could see that each cold night adding a new coating to the crystals that were already there, building them up into complex structures that resembled nothing so much as the tiny leaves of some impossible winter plant. She reached out and touched one of the stalks with the tip of a finger, and the ice crystals shattered at her touch, falling away in a small shower of glittering dust that was gone before it reached the snow. The stalk beneath was brown and dry and utterly unremarkable, and she felt a small pang of regret for having destroyed something so delicate and temporary, even though she knew it would form again in the next cold night. She walked on, past the hyssop and past the bed of lemon balm, which was planted in the sunniest corner of the eastern wall, and which she had covered with an upturned clay pot to protect it from the worst of the weather. The clay pot was visible as a smooth, rounded hump in the snow, its shape unmistakable once you knew what it was, and she did not disturb it because she knew that the lemon balm beneath it was sleeping safely in its small pocket of still, cold air. The last bed on the eastern side was planted with angelica, a tall, stately plant that grew to 6 feet in the summer and produced large umbels of greenish-white flowers that she harvested and dried for use in treating coughs and colds, and the general weakness that came with old age. The angelica was a biennial, meaning it grew leaves the first year and flowered the second, and she had a careful system of planting and replanting to ensure that she always had some angelica in its first year, and some in its second. The second-year plants were the ones that would flower and set seed and then die, and she had marked their locations in the autumn with small sticks pushed into the soil, sticks that were now buried under the snow, but whose positions she remembered with the precision of long familiarity. She turned at the south end of the garden and looked back along the central path toward the gate. The stone bench was to her right, a solid block of grey granite that had been carved from the same quarry as the Abbey walls, and set in place so long ago that no one living remembered who had done the work. The bench was covered with a thick layer of snow that had settled into a shape resembling a loaf of bread fresh from the oven, a smooth, rounded dome that rose about a foot above the seat of the bench and sloped gently down to the edges. The snow on the bench was untouched, pristine, a perfect white shape that seemed almost deliberate, as if someone had sculpted it for the pleasure of seeing something so simple and so pure. Sister Clémence did not sit on the bench, of course, because sitting on a block of frozen stone in the middle of January was an invitation to a chill that would settle into the bones and not leave until spring. But she stood beside it for a moment and looked at the snow that covered it, and she thought about the summer afternoons when she would sit on this same bench with a cup of cool water from the well and listen to the bees moving among the lavender flowers and feel the sun warm on her face. That memory was so distant now that it seemed like something she had read in a book rather than something she had lived, but she held on to it because the memory of warmth was one of the things that made the winter bearable. The western side of the garden was planted with different herbs, plants that preferred a bit more shade or that needed to be kept separate from the others, for reasons she had learned from the sister who had taught her and who had learned from the sister before her. There was a bed of chamomile near the gate, the low-growing Roman chamomile that spread into a dense mat of feathery leaves and produced small daisy-like flowers with a sweet, apple-like scent. The chamomile was hardy and reliable, and she could see the faint green of its evergreen leaves peeking through the snow in a few places where the cover was thin, a color so subtle it was almost grey, but which her eyes recognized as a promise of life. Beyond the chamomile was a bed of lady's mantle, a plant with broad, pleated leaves that caught the morning dew in perfect round droplets, and beyond that was the wormwood, a tall, silvery plant with a bitter taste that she used sparingly and only for the most stubborn digestive complaints. The wormwood was completely dormant now, its silver leaves long since fallen and its woody stems standing bare and dark against the snow, looking like the skeletons of some small trees planted in a row. She walked along the western beds, repeating the same slow ritual of brushing snow, checking straw, examining the frozen soil beneath. The chamomile was in good condition, its mat of leaves pressed flat by the snow, but still alive and green beneath the white cover. The lady's mantle was more exposed, the pleated leaves having caught the snow and held it in small cups that had frozen solid, and she carefully brushed the ice away from the crowns of the plants to make sure they were not being smothered. The wormwood she did not touch, because the wormwood needed nothing from her. It was a plant that thrived on neglect and would come back stronger than ever in the spring, whether she tended it or not. And at the far end of the western side, in the corner where the south wall met the west wall and created a small pocket of sheltered warmth, was the bed of lavender. The lavender was Sister Clémence's favourite plant, though she would never have said so aloud, because a nun was not supposed to have favourites among the gifts of God's creation. But the lavender was different, and she knew it, and she suspected that God knew it too, and did not mind. The lavender plants were small shrubs now, their woody stems branching out from a central crown, and spreading into a rounded shape about 2 feet across. In the summer, these shrubs were covered with narrow grey-green leaves and tall spikes of purple flowers that filled the garden with a scent so clean and calming that patients in the infirmary would sometimes ask to have a sprig of lavender placed on their pillows to help them sleep. Now, in the deep of winter, the lavender was a collection of bare grey branches that looked dead but were not, their living tissue tucked deep inside the wood and protected by a layer of rough bark. Sister Clémence had covered the crowns of the lavender plants with a thick layer of straw and then placed a loose pile of dried bracken fern over the top to catch the snow and create an insulating air pocket. The bracken was brown and brittle now, and the snow had settled into it and frozen into a solid cap that she could see from where she stood. She did not disturb the lavender, because the lavender was sleeping as deeply as any plant in the garden, and waking it too early would do more harm than good. She stood for a long time at the lavender bed, her hands tucked into her sleeves and her breath forming slow clouds in the still air. The garden was utterly quiet, the kind of quiet that seems to have a weight and a presence of its own, a quiet that presses against the ears and makes the slightest sound seem loud and significant. She could hear, very faintly, the distant sound of the Abbey bell ringing for terce, the mid-morning prayer, a sound that travelled across the snow and through the stone walls and reached her as a low, mellow tone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She turned away from the lavender and began the slow walk back toward the gate, her footsteps retracing the line of holes she had made in the snow on her way down the garden. The holes were already beginning to fill with the fine, dry snow that the wind was moving across the surface, and by evening they would be gone, erased by the patient work of the winter that was always smoothing and softening and covering over the marks left by living things. At the gate, she paused and looked back one more time. The garden lay under its blanket of white, the raised beds visible as gentle mounds, the wattle edging as faint lines, the stone bench as a smooth loaf of bread, the dead stalks of the hyssop as a delicate framework for the ice crystals that would form again tonight. Nothing was growing, nothing was changing in any way that could be seen or measured, and yet the garden was not dead. It was waiting, holding its life deep underground where the frost could not reach, storing the memory of sun and rain and the slow chemistry of growth in the dark silence of the frozen soil. Sister Clémence understood this waiting because she had been doing it herself for 23 winters, and she knew that the secret was simply to endure, to do the small necessary things each day, and to trust that the spring would come as it always had and always would. She pulled the heavy door closed behind her and turned the key in the lock, and the garden settled back into its white silence, holding its shape under the snow and waiting for the slow return of the light. The infirmary hall in the deep of winter was a room that seemed to exist outside of time, a long rectangle of muted light and slow breathing where the hours passed not in minutes but in the gradual shifting of shadows across a stone floor. Sister Clémence had spent more of her life in this room than in any other single place within the Abbey walls, and she had come to know its particular character in each season, the way the summer heat gathered under the low ceiling and made the air thick with the smell of dried herbs and old wool, the way the autumn draughts found every crack in the window frames and set the hanging oil lamps swaying on their chains, and the way the winter settled into the very stones and refused to be disturbed by anything less than a miracle. On this particular January morning in the year 1420, the winter stillness was so complete that it felt like a physical presence, a patient visitor who had taken a seat in the corner and intended to stay until spring. The infirmary was not a large space by the standards of great cathedrals or noble houses, but it was the largest single room in the Abbey of Sainte Geneviève, measuring perhaps 40 feet in length and 20 in width. The ceiling was low, supported by dark oak beams that had been cut from trees that were already old when the Abbey was founded 3 centuries earlier, and the beams had warped slightly over the years so that they no longer ran in perfectly straight lines, but dipped and rose in gentle curves that caught the eye and led it wandering across the expanse of aged wood. The floor was made of the same grey stone as the rest of the Abbey, worn smooth in the centre by generations of feet, but rough and pitted near the walls where no one walked. Fresh rushes had been spread across the stones at the start of winter, and they had been sprinkled with dried lavender and a little rosemary to sweeten the air, but the rushes were now 2 months old and had been trodden down into a dense mat that released a faint, dusty smell whenever anyone walked across them. Sister Clémence made a mental note to have the rushes changed when the weather broke, though the weather showed no sign of breaking and would not for many weeks. The light in the infirmary came from 2 sources, neither of which was sufficient to truly illuminate the space, but both of which combined to create a soft, diffuse glow that was easy on the eyes and conducive to sleep. The first source was a series of narrow windows set high in the north wall, their openings covered not with glass but with oiled linen stretched tight over wooden frames. The linen allowed a pale, filtered version of the outside light to enter, a light that had already been softened by the heavy clouds that hung over the countryside and was further muted by the layer of frost that had formed on the inside of the fabric overnight. The second source was a small fire that burned continuously in the hearth set into the east wall, a fire that was tended with great care to ensure it never blazed too hot and never died completely. The hearth was large enough to hold 3 good-sized logs, but the Abbey's supply of firewood was carefully rationed through the winter months, and so only 1 log burned at a time, producing a modest flame that flickered and danced and cast long wavering shadows that moved across the walls like slow, silent ghosts. The smoke rose up through a chimney that had been built into the thickness of the stone wall, though some small portion of it always seemed to escape into the room, adding a thin, acrid note to the air that mingled with the smell of the rushes and the faint, medicinal scent of the dried herbs stored in the jars along the back wall. The patients in the infirmary on this morning were few in number and quiet in disposition, which was the usual state of affairs in the winter months, when the hard labor of the fields was suspended and the community had less opportunity to injure itself. Brother Martin, a man of perhaps 70 years whose exact age no one could remember because he had been old when the current abbess was a novice, lay on a straw pallet in the corner nearest the hearth. His eyes were closed, and his breathing was slow and even, and the only sign that he was alive rather than a carving of a sleeping monk was the occasional twitch of his right hand where it lay on the rough wool blanket that covered him. Brother Martin suffered from a stiffness in his joints that made walking difficult in the cold weather, a condition that Sister Clement treated with warm compresses soaked in a decoction of willow bark and meadow sweet, though the treatment was less a cure than a comfort, and everyone understood this without needing to say it aloud. Across the room, on a similar pallet but further from the fire, lay Brother Paul, a man of middle years who had come to the infirmary 3 days earlier with a cough that rattled deep in his chest and refused to loosen its grip. The cough had improved slightly after 2 days of steam inhalations with hyssop and thyme, and now Brother Paul slept for long stretches, his face pale but peaceful, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that was shallow but regular. The third patient was not a patient in the strict sense, but a member of the infirmary household, a large grey cat of indeterminate origin who had appeared at the Abbey gates 5 winters ago and had immediately established herself as the unofficial guardian of the infirmary hearth. The cat had no name because the rule of the order discouraged attachments to animals, but everyone called her the Grey Sister in their private thoughts, and she spent her days curled on a folded blanket near the fire, rising only to eat the scraps left from the kitchen or to patrol the edges of the room for mice. On this morning, the Grey Sister was asleep with her tail wrapped around her nose, a position that suggested she had no intention of moving until the fire was replenished or the dinner scraps arrived, whichever came first. Sister Clemence glanced at the cat as she crossed the room, and the cat opened one yellow eye, regarded her for a long moment with the complete indifference of a creature who owed nothing to anyone, and then closed the eye again and returned to whatever dreams occupied the mind of a sleeping cat in a medieval abbey. The task that awaited Sister Clemence on this winter morning was one of the quiet, repetitive duties that filled the hours between the liturgical offices and gave shape to the long, dark days. It was the task of sorting and inspecting the dried stores, the jars and bundles and linen bags that contained the previous summer's harvest of medicinal herbs and that would need to last until the next summer's growth could be gathered. The infirmary still room, where the herbs were prepared and the remedies were compounded, was too cold for this kind of careful work because the small brazier that heated the space was lit only when a preparation was actually being made, and the rest of the time the still room was as cold as the outside air, which was very cold indeed. So the salting was done in the infirmary hall itself, at a small table that Sister Clemence had placed near the hearth, close enough to the fire that her fingers would not grow numb, but far enough away that the heat would not damage the dried plants or cause them to lose their potency. The table was a simple piece of furniture, a rectangular board of smooth planed oak, set upon 2 trestles that could be folded and stored against the wall when the space was needed for other purposes. Sister Clemence had covered the table with a square of clean, unbleached linen, and upon this cloth she now began to arrange the items she would need for the morning's work. First came a small clay bowl filled with clean water for moistening her fingertips when the dried leaves became too brittle to handle without crumbling. Next came a stack of clean linen squares, each about the size of her outstretched hand, for wiping the rims of the jars and for blotting any moisture that might have accumulated inside the containers. Then came a small wooden scoop carved from a single piece of beechwood, its bowl worn smooth by years of use and stained a soft brown from contact with countless different plant materials. And finally came a collection of clay jars, each sealed with a disc of waxed linen tied down with a length of hemp twine, which she retrieved one by one from the deep shelves that lined the north wall of the infirmary. The shelves themselves were a study in patient organization, a system that Sister Clemence had developed over many years, and that made perfect sense to her, even if it appeared chaotic to anyone else who looked at it. The jars were not labeled with the names of their contents, because Sister Clemence could identify each one by its shape and the particular sound it made when tapped with a fingernail, and because she had placed them on the shelves in an order that followed the layout of the garden itself, so that the jar of chamomile sat next to the jar of lavender, just as the chamomile plants grew next to the lavender bed in the garden wall. The jars themselves were of various sizes and colors. Some a deep reddish-brown with a glossy glaze, others a paler terracotta with a matte surface that felt slightly rough to the touch, and still others a greenish-gray that had been fired at a lower temperature and was more porous. Each jar had been made by a different potter in a different year, purchased or bartered or given as a gift, and each one held a specific memory of its acquisition. The tall jar with the wide mouth that held the dried yarrow had come from a travelling merchant who had passed through the village 5 summers ago and had accepted a bundle of dried lavender in exchange, while the small round jar that held the crushed juniper berries had been left at the Abbey gate by an unknown benefactor and had been sitting on the shelf for so long that no one could remember if time went it would. Sister Clemence selected the first jar, a medium-sized container with a fitted lid, and the remains of a blue glaze that had mostly worn away except in the deep grooves of the potter's thumbprints. She knew without opening it that this jar contained the dried chamomile flowers that had been gathered in late July of the previous year, when the small white and yellow blossoms were at their peak of fragrance, and the bees had been so thick around the plants that the air seemed to hum. She broke the wax seal with her thumbnail, the brittle wax cracking and falling away in small fragments that she collected in her palm, and set aside to be melted down and reused for the next sealing. The linen cover beneath the wax came away with a soft tearing sound, revealing the dark interior of the jar and releasing a faint, sweet scent that rose up and mingled with the wood smoke and the wool and the old rushes, a scent that was like a small piece of summer, preserved in clay and hidden away against the long winter. She tilted the jar and poured a small amount of the dried flowers onto the linen cloth, a cascade of pale yellow and white that settled into a mound no larger than a hen's egg. The chamomile flowers had dried well, their petals still intact, and their centers still firm, and they had retained much of their original color, despite the months that had passed since they were picked. Sister Clemence spread them out with her fingertip, separating the individual flower heads and inspecting them for any sign of dampness or mold, any dark spots or strange odors that would indicate spoilage. She found none, and after a long moment of quiet satisfaction, she scooped the flowers back into the jar, pressed the linen cover back into place, and set the jar aside to be resealed later. The next jar was larger and heavier, and she had to use both hands to lift it from the shelf and carry it to the table. This one contained the dried sage leaves, which had been harvested in late summer, when the leaves were fully developed and rich with the aromatic oils that made the plant so valuable for treating sore throats and calming upset stomachs. The sage had been dried in bundles hung from the rafters of the stillroom, and then the leaves had been stripped from the stems and packed into the jar in layers, each layer separated by a thin piece of unbleached linen to prevent the leaves from sticking together. Sister Clemence removed the lid and reached inside, her fingers finding the edge of the topmost linen layer and lifting it away to reveal the sage beneath. The leaves were a soft grey-green color, their surfaces covered with a fine velvety down that caught the firelight and gave them a silvery sheen. She selected a single leaf and held it up to the light, noting the network of veins that ran through the thin tissue and the way the edges curled slightly inward, a sign that the leaf had dried slowly and retained its essential character. She crushed the leaf between her thumb and forefinger, and the dry tissue crumbled into small fragments that released a sharp, clean, slightly bitter fragrance, the unmistakable smell of sage that seemed to clear the sinuses and wake the mind even as the rest of the room drowsed in the winter quiet. The sage was in good condition, dry and potent and ready for use, and she returned the linen layer to its place and set the jar beside the chamomile. The morning passed in this slow, methodical fashion. Each jar opened and inspected and closed again. Each dried plant assessed for its quality and its quantity and its readiness for the months ahead. There was the jar of dried mint, its leaves a uniform dark green that crumbled easily and released a cool, refreshing scent that seemed at odds with the warm, stuffy air of the infirmary. There was the jar of dried rosemary, the needle-like leaves, still sharp and fragrant after months of storage, their surface slightly sticky with the residual oils that had not fully dried. There was the jar of dried lemon balm, a plant that Sister Clémence valued for its gentle, calming effect on patients who were anxious or unable to sleep. Its leaves a pale greenish-brown that smelled faintly of citrus and honey. There was the jar of dried betony, a plant that had been used since Roman times for headaches and nervous complaints, its leaves and flowers pressed together into a dense mass that required careful teasing apart with the fingers. And there was the jar of dried hyssop, a plant mentioned in the Psalms and valued for its ability to clear the lungs and ease the breathing of patients like Brother Paul who suffered from winter coughs and congestions. As she worked, Sister Clémence was aware of the slow movement of the light across the room, a movement so gradual that it could only be perceived by looking away and then looking back, by noting the position of the pale rectangle cast by the oiled linen window on the far wall, and then checking it again after a dozen jars had been opened and closed. The light crept across the stone floor in increments, illuminating first the edge of Brother Martin's pallet, and then the folds of his blanket, and then his still, peaceful face, before moving on to the next patch of floor, and the next, a patient traveller making its way across a landscape of worn stone and scattered rushes. The fire in the hearth settled lower in its bed of ash, and Sister Clémence rose from her stool and selected a fresh log from the pile beside the hearth, a piece of split oak that had been drying for 2 years and would burn slowly and steadily and produce a good, lasting heat. She placed the log on the embers and watched for a moment as the fire found the new fuel and began to explore its surface, small flames, licking at the rough bark and sending up thin curls of white smoke that twisted and dissolved in the draught from the chimney. The cat, disturbed by the movement near her sleeping place, lifted her head and regarded Sister Clémence with the same expression of mild disapproval that she wore for all human activities that did not directly involve food. Sister Clémence reached down and scratched the cat behind one ear, a gesture that was met with a brief narrowing of the eyes that might have been pleasure or might have been tolerance, and then she returned to her stool and her jars and the quiet, absorbing work of the winter apothecary. The last jar she opened on this particular morning was one of the smallest, a delicate little pot with a fitted cork stopper that contained the dried lavender flowers. Lavender was Sister Clémence's favorite among all the plants she grew and harvested and stored, not because it was the most potent medicine or the most versatile remedy, but because of its steadfast reliability and its gentle, unassuming beauty. The dried flowers were a soft purple-grey color, their tiny petals still clinging to the central stems, and when she removed the cork stopper, the fragrance that rose from the jar was so pure and so so evocative of summer that she closed her eyes for a long moment and simply breathed it in. She could see in her mind's eye the long row of lavender plants along the garden path, their silvery green foliage and their tall spikes of purple flowers swaying in the warm breeze while the bees worked their way from blossom to blossom with a low, contented hum. She could feel the sun on her back and the rough texture of the woven basket in her hands as she moved down the row, selecting the stems that were ready for harvest and leaving the others to mature a few more days. She could hear the sound of the chapel bell calling the community to prayer, a sound that was muffled by the thick stone walls of the Abbey, but still audible in the garden, a reminder that the work of the hands and the work of the Spirit were not separate things, but two aspects of a single life. She opened her eyes, and the infirmary hall came back into focus. The low ceiling, the dark beams, the sleeping monks, the grey cat, the patient fire. The lavender flowers in the jar were still fragrant and dry and perfectly preserved, ready to be used in the small cloth sachets that she placed under the pillows of patients who had trouble sleeping, or in the warm baths that eased the aches of old bones, or simply left in an open bowl to sweeten the air of a room that had been closed against the winter for too long. She replaced the cork stopper, pressing it firmly into the neck of the jar, and set the lavender alongside the chamomile and the sage, and all the other jars that had passed inspection. The light from the high window had moved further across the floor while she worked, and it now illuminated the base of the stone wall near the door, revealing the small irregular marks left by the masons who had built the abbey centuries ago. Sister Clémence looked at the light and understood, without needing to consult any clock or bell, that the morning was nearly gone and that the hour of sext, the midday prayer, was approaching. She gathered the inspected jars and returned them to their places on the shelves, each one fitting into its designated spot with the familiarity of long acquaintance. She folded the linen cloth and set it aside for laundering, emptied the small bowl of water into the ashes of the hearth where it hissed softly and sent up a small cloud of steam, and placed the wooden scoop back in its niche. The infirmary hall settled back into its winter stillness, the same stillness that had been there when she began her work, a stillness that was not empty, but full, heavy with the quiet breathing of the patients, and the soft crackle of the fire, and the patient, enduring presence of the dried herbs, sleeping in their clay jars, waiting for the moment when they would be called upon to ease a pain, or calm a fever, or simply remind someone that summer had once existed, and would exist again. Sister Clémence smoothed the front of her habit, checked that Brother Paul's blanket was still covering his shoulders, and walked slowly toward the door that led to the cloister, leaving behind the warm, drowsy air of the infirmary, and stepping out into the sharper cold of the stone passage, where the sound of the prayer bell was just beginning to ring. On a day when the wind dropped, and the heavy clouds that had pressed down upon the countryside for what felt like weeks finally thinned enough to allow a pale, watery sun to appear low in the southern sky, Sister Clémence made her way to the most sheltered corner of the infirmary garden. The change in the weather was not dramatic. There was no sudden warmth that set the icicles dripping from the eaves or turned the snow to slush underfoot, but the absence of the biting wind that had been blowing steadily from the northeast for so many days made the air feel almost gentle by comparison. The sun, when it appeared through the high veil of cloud, was the color of old pewter, a pale disk that cast shadows so faint they were more like suggestions of shadows, grey smudges on the white snow that shifted and faded as the clouds thickened and thinned. It was the kind of winter day that offered no promise of spring, but at least withdrew the harshest edge of winter's hostility, a small mercy that Sister Clémence accepted with the same quiet gratitude she brought to all the small mercies of her enclosed life. The corner of the garden she sought was the angle where the south wall met the east wall, a junction of warm grey stone that faced the midday sun and absorbed whatever feeble heat the January light could offer. The walls in this corner were higher than the walls on the other sides of the garden, rising perhaps 12 feet to the eaves of the infirmary roof that sloped away toward the north. The additional height, combined with the angle of the two walls meeting, created a pocket of still air that was protected from the worst of the wind, and that held on to the memory of the sun's warmth longer than any other spot in the garden. Sister Clémence had learned this fact during her first winter as the infirmarian's assistant, when the old nun who held the position before her had shown her this corner and explained that it was the place where the most tender plants could be overwintered and where the root vegetables could be left in the ground for harvest through the cold months. The old nun was long dead now, buried in the small cemetery behind the chapel, but her knowledge lived on in the arrangement of the garden beds and in the habits of the woman who had inherited her duties. The snow in this sheltered corner was shallower than in the rest of the garden, not because less snow had fallen here, but because the angle of the walls had deflected some of the drifting flakes, and because the faint warmth retained by the stones had melted a thin layer from the bottom of the accumulation. The surface of the snow here was different too, not the soft, powdery texture of the open beds, but a slightly crusted surface that crunched under Sister Clémence's shoes with a sound like the breaking of very thin ice on a puddle. She stopped at the edge of the corner bed and looked down at the snow-covered rectangle, a space perhaps 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, that was bordered on two sides by the stone walls and on the other two sides by low wattle edging that was just barely visible as a pair of parallel ridges in the white surface. This bed served a different purpose from the medicinal herb beds that occupied the rest of the garden. It was the kitchen garden's winter outpost, a place where root vegetables could be stored in the ground and harvested as needed. and where a few perennial herbs that required extra protection could be tucked against the warm stones and coaxed through the coldest months. The parsnips were the primary occupants of this bed, a crop that Sister Clémence had planted in the late summer after the early peas had been harvested, and the ground had been turned and enriched with a layer of well-rotted compost from the heap behind the stable. Parsnips were a patient vegetable, content to grow slowly through the autumn and then to sit in the frozen ground through the winter, their long white taproots converting starch to sugar in response to the cold and becoming sweeter and more flavorful with each passing week of frost. The kitchen sisters valued the parsnips for their ability to add substance and a mild nutty sweetness to the thin broths and pottages that sustained the community through the lean months when fresh greens were only a memory. Sister Clémence valued them for their reliability, for the quiet way they waited underground without complaint or demand, asking nothing of her except that she remember where they were buried and that she not damage them when she came to dig them up. She knelt at the edge of the bed, her knees sinking into the crusted snow and then through it to the softer layer beneath, the cold seeping through the wool of her habit and the linen of her undergarments with a slow, patient insistence. She had brought with her a small wooden dibber, a tool that consisted of a handle carved from a piece of beechwood and a pointed tip that had been hardened in the fire to resist wear. The dibber was an unremarkable object, stained dark from years of contact with soil and smooth from the oils of countless handlings, and it lived in a niche by the garden gate, along with a few other simple tools that were needed for the winter work. Sister Clémence held the dibber in her right hand and used her left hand to brush the snow away from a small area near the center of the bed, revealing the layer of straw mulch that protected the soil beneath. The straw here was darker and wetter than the straw in the medicinal beds, because this corner received a little more sun and the snow melted and refroze more frequently, creating a cycle of dampness that had begun to break down the straw into a matted, compost-like layer. The smell that rose from the disturbed straw was earthy and slightly sweet, the smell of vegetation slowly returning to the soil from which it had grown. She set the dibber aside for a moment and used both hands to clear a larger patch of straw, working carefully so as not to disturb the soil beneath any more than necessary. The frozen ground, when it was finally exposed, was a dark brown color that appeared almost black in the weak winter light, and its surface was not smooth but slightly uneven, marked by small lumps and depressions that told the story of the roots and worms and frost heaves that had shaped it over the preceding months. Near the center of the cleared area, a pale protrusion caught her eye, a small rounded shape that rose just above the level of the surrounding soil, and that was the color of old ivory or fresh cream. It was the shoulder of a parsnip, the topmost portion of the long taproot where it narrowed into the stub of the previous year's leaf stalks, pushed slightly upward by the repeated freezing and thawing of the surface soil. The frost heave, as this phenomenon was called, was a common occurrence in the winter garden, and it was one of the reasons Sister Clémence checked this bed regularly even when no parsnips were needed for the kitchen. A root that was pushed too far out to the ground could be damaged by exposure to the drying wind or eaten by the hungry mice that lived in the walls and ventured out when their stored supplies ran low. She picked up the dibber and began the slow, careful work of freeing the parsnip from the frozen earth. The tool's pointed tip was not sharp enough to cut through the hard soil easily, but that was by design, because a sharper tool might slice into the tender root and ruin it for the kitchen. Instead, the dibber worked by concentrating force into a small area, breaking the frozen crust and allowing the gardener to pry away small chunks of soil one at a time. Sister Clémence inserted the tip into the ground a few inches from the exposed shoulder of the parsnip and pressed down with the weight of her body, feeling the resistance of the frozen earth and then the slight give as a crack formed and a piece of soil broke free. She worked her way around the parsnip in a slow circle, loosening the ground on all sides before attempting to lift the root itself, because pulling on a parsnip that was still firmly frozen into the soil was a reliable way to break it in half and leave the lower portion buried and useless. The process was slow and repetitive, a rhythm of insert and press and pry that required patience and a steady hand, and Sister Clémence fell into it with the same calm attention she brought to all her garden tasks, her mind quiet and her breathing slow and her fingers growing steadily colder as they gripped the wooden handle. When she had loosened the soil around the entire circumference of the parsnip, She set the dibber aside and wrapped the fingers of both hands around the exposed crown of the root. The surface was cold and slightly rough, covered with tiny root hairs and the remnants of the leaf bases that had dried and withered in the autumn. She pulled gently at first, testing the resistance, and then with more steady pressure, rocking the root slightly from side to side to encourage it to release its grip on the frozen earth. There was a moment of suspension, a feeling of something holding fast and refusing to let go, and then the parsnip came free with a soft, wet sound and a small shower of frozen soil particles that scattered across the snow like dark grains of coarse sand. Sister Clemence sat back on her heels and held the parsnip up to the light, turning it slowly to examine its condition. The parsnip was a fine specimen, longer than her forearm and tapering from a broad shoulder nearly 3 inches across to a slender tip no thicker than her little finger. The skin was a uniform pale ivory color, smooth except for the small indentations where the side roots had been and the faint horizontal rings that marked the boundaries between seasons of growth. A few fine root hairs still clung to the lower portion, coated with frozen soil that gave them the appearance of tiny dark beads strung on invisible threads. The parsnip was perfectly solid and heavy in her hand, its flesh firm and unblemished by the tunnels of burrowing insects or the dark spots of rot that sometimes afflicted roots left too long in wet ground. It was, in short, exactly what a winter parsnip should be, a store of sweetness and nourishment preserved by the cold earth and ready to be transformed into sustenance for the community. She set the parsnip carefully on the snow beside the hole from which it had come and turned her attention back to the bed. The hole itself was a dark cavity in the white and brown landscape, its sides glistening with the moisture that had been locked in the frozen soil and was now beginning to melt very slowly in the slightly warmer air of the sheltered corner. At the bottom of the hole she could see the pale tip of another parsnip, the next in the row she had planted, still safely buried and waiting for its turn to be harvested. She made a mental note of its position and then began to fill the hole with the loose soil she had removed, packing it down gently with her fingers to protect the remaining roots from exposure. The straw mulch was replaced in a thick layer over the disturbed area, and then the snow was brushed back into place, erasing most of the evidence that she had been there at all. The bed would look untouched by the next morning, the patient work of the winter smoothing over all the marks left by human hands. With a parsnip resting on the snow beside her, Sister Clemence shifted her attention to the other occupant of this sheltered corner, the small clump of lungwort that grew at the very base of the south wall, where the stones met the soil and created a microclimate that was a few degrees warmer than anywhere else in the garden. Lungwort was not a plant that most gardeners would bother to tend. It was a humble, unassuming perennial with broad, hairy leaves that were often spotted with pale markings that resembled, to the medieval eye, the diseased tissue of a human lung. This resemblance, according to the doctrine of signatures that guided much of the era's medical thinking, was a sign from God that the plant was intended to treat ailments of the lungs, and Sister Clemence had found that a tea made from the dried leaves did indeed seem to ease the coughing and congestion of patients like Brother Paul, who suffered from winter chest complaints. Whether the effect came from some genuine medicinal property of the plant, or from the comfort of warm liquid in the patient's belief in the treatment, was a question she did not trouble herself to answer. The lungwort grew, and she harvested it, and the patients drank the tea, and sometimes they felt better, and that was sufficient. The lungwort in the corner was a single plant that had established itself many years ago, probably from a seed dropped by a bird or carried on the hem of a gardener's robe, and it had slowly spread into a low mound of evergreen leaves that persisted through the winter when most other plants had died back to the ground. Sister Clemence brushed the snow away from the base of the wall with careful, gentle strokes, revealing the dark green foliage that lay pressed flat against the soil. The leaves were broad and oval, about the length of her thumb, and their surfaces were covered with a fine, stiff fuzz that gave them a slightly silvery appearance in the weak light. The characteristic pale spots that gave the plant its name were visible on the older leaves, irregular blotches of a lighter green that stood out against the darker background. The newer leaves, those that had emerged late in the autumn, were a uniform deep green without spots, and they were smaller and more tightly curled against the cold, holding their edges inward as if to conserve whatever warmth they contained. She touched one of the leaves with her fingertip, feeling the rough texture of the hairs and the surprising resilience of the living tissue beneath. The leaf was cold, of course, as cold as the air and the stone and the frozen soil. But it was not brittle or dead. It flexed slightly under her touch, and then returned to its original shape. A small demonstration of the stubborn vitality that allowed this modest plant to remain green, while everything around it was white and grey and brown. Sister Clémence did not need to harvest any lungwort on this day. The jar of dried leaves in the infirmary still held a sufficient supply. But she wanted to check the plant's condition and assure herself that it was surviving the winter as well as could be expected. She noted that the crown of the plant, the central point from which new leaves would emerge in the spring, was well protected by the dense mat of old foliage and by its position tucked so close to the warm stones of the wall. The lungwort would be fine, she decided, and she carefully replaced the snow around the plant, patting it into a loose mound that would insulate the leaves from the coldest air without smothering them. The parsnip still lay on the snow where she had placed it, a pale shape against the white surface, and she picked it up and brushed the remaining soil from its skin with the edge of her sleeve. The root was cold and heavy in her hand, and she thought about the journey it would take from this sheltered corner to the Abbey kitchen, and then to the wooden bowls of the community at the evening meal. The kitchen sisters would scrub it clean in cold water from the well, then slice it into thin rounds that would be added to a pot of barley and dried beans and a few precious shreds of salted meat, saved from the autumn slaughter. The pot would hang over the kitchen fire for hours, simmering gently, and the parsnip would soften and release its stored sweetness into the broth, transforming a simple meal into something that tasted of the earth and the patient work of the garden and the long, quiet months of winter waiting. Sister Clémence would sit at her place in the refectory, eating her portion in silence, while one of the younger sisters read aloud from a sacred text, and she would taste the parsnip and remember this moment in the sheltered corner, the weak sun on her face and the cold stone at her back, and the small green leaves of the lungwort pressed against the wall. She stood up slowly, her knees stiff from kneeling on the frozen ground and her fingers numb from the cold despite the protection of her wool sleeves. The sun had moved perceptibly across the sky during the time she had been working, shifting from its low position in the south to a slightly lower position in the southwest, and the quality of the light had begun to change from the pale, watery brightness of midday to the softer, greyer tones of the approaching afternoon. The shadows cast by the walls were longer now, reaching out across the snow of the garden and blurring at their edges as the thin clouds thickened once more. Sister Clémence tucked the parsnip into the deep pocket she had sewn into the inside of her cloak for just this purpose, feeling the cold weight of it settle against her hip, and she turned away from the sheltered corner and began the slow walk back toward the garden gate. Her footsteps retraced the path she had made on her way in, a line of dark holes in the crusted snow that marked her passage and would remain visible until the next snowfall or the next strong wind erased them. The garden lay quiet around her, the raised beds and the wattle edging and the stone bench all holding their familiar shapes under their covering of white, a landscape reduced to its essentials by the patient hand of winter. The lavender was sleeping under its bracken blanket, the comfrey and the betony were dreaming deep underground. The hyssop stalks stood bare and brittle and waiting for the ice crystals that would form on them in the night. Only the sheltered corner held any visible sign of life. The small dark green leaves of the lungwort that persisted through the cold, a quiet refusal to surrender entirely to the season of stillness. At the gate she paused and looked back one more time, her breath forming a slow cloud that hung in the still air before dissipating. The corner where she had worked was visible as a slightly disturbed patch of snow, a place where the white surface had been broken and then mended, and she felt the same quiet satisfaction she always felt after tending the winter garden. The work was small and slow and largely invisible. It did not produce the dramatic transformations of spring planting or summer harvest, but it was necessary work nonetheless. It was the work of maintenance and protection, of making sure that the living things entrusted to her care survived the cold months so that they could fulfill their purpose when the warm months returned. The parsnip in her pocket was evidence of that purpose fulfilled, a tangible reward for the patient labor of kneeling in the snow and prying frozen soil from around a buried root. She pulled the heavy door open and stepped through, leaving the garden to its white silence, and the door swung shut behind her with the soft, snow-dampened thump that had become one of the familiar sounds of her winter days. The still room was a small chamber tucked between the back wall of the infirmary kitchen and the outer wall of the abbey, a space so modest in its dimensions that Sister Clemence could stand in the center and touch both side walls with her outstretched hands. The room had been carved out of the thickness of the original abbey walls some century earlier, when the community had grown large enough to require a dedicated place for preparing herbal remedies and distilling medicinal waters, and it bore the marks of its practical purpose in every corner. The floor was made of the same grey stone as the rest of the abbey, but it sloped gently toward a drain hole in the corner that led to a channel running out to the garden, a concession to the spills and splashes that were inevitable when working with liquids in copper vessels. The walls were lined with deep shelves that held an orderly collection of clay jars, copper basins, linen strainers, and bundles of dried herbs hanging from wooden pegs, their stems tied with hemp twine and their leaves rustling softly whenever the door was opened and the air stirred. A single window, small and high, and covered with oiled linen, admitted a pale, diffuse light that seemed to struggle against the gloom of the windowless interior, and the only other source of illumination was the fire that Sister Clemence had come to light. The centerpiece of the still room was a large copper pot that sat upon an iron trivet over a low hearth built into the base of the north wall. The pot was old, older than anyone in the abbey could remember, and it had been made by a coppersmith whose name was long forgotten, but whose skill was evident in the even thickness of the metal and the smooth, hammered surface that caught the firelight and glowed with a warm, rosy luster. The pot was wide at the base and slightly narrower at the top, a shape that encouraged the even heating of its contents and minimized the loss of steam, and it had a fitted copper lid with a small ring handle that was always hot to the touch and required a folded cloth to lift safely. Sister Clemence had cleaned the pot the previous evening, scouring its interior with fine sand and rinsing it with cold water until the metal shone, and now it sat empty and waiting on its trivet, a patient vessel ready to receive whatever the day's work required. The task that brought Sister Clemence to the still room on this particular afternoon was a simple one: the preparation of a restorative tisane for the general warmth and comfort of the infirmary patients. Brother Paul's cough had improved over the past days but still lingered in his chest, a dry, rattling sound that disturbed his sleep and left him tired and listless during the waking hours. Brother Martin's joints had stiffened further in the continued cold, and though the warm compresses of willow bark provided some relief, a cup of something warm and soothing to drink would ease his spirits even if it could not cure his aching bones. And there was a new patient in the infirmary, an elderly lay sister who helped in the kitchen and who had slipped on an icy patch near the well 2 mornings ago, twisting her ankle and bruising her hip. She was not seriously injured, but she was shaken and cold and in need of the kind of comfort that came from a warm cup held between her palms and the gentle, familiar taste of herbs that spoke of summer and safety and care. The tisane would serve all of them, a small, warm kindness in the middle of a long, cold winter. Sister Clemence began her work by tending to the hearth, which had been cold since the previous evening's preparations and now held nothing but a bed of fine grey ash and the blackened remnants of the last log that had burned there. She knelt on the stone floor, her knees finding the 2 worn hollows where countless other knees had rested before hers, and she reached for the small iron shovel that hung from a hook beside the hearth. The ash was cold and dry, and it rose in a fine grey cloud as she scooped it into a waiting bucket, the particles hanging in the still air and settling slowly onto every surface. She worked with slow, patient strokes, emptying the ash bed completely, and then using a small birch broom to sweep the hearthstones clean, revealing the fire-blackened surface beneath. The stones were warm to the touch despite the hours that had passed since the last fire, a reminder that the masonry of the abbey held heat in its deep places and released it slowly, grudgingly, over the long winter nights. When the hearth was clean, she began to build the new fire with the same methodical care she brought to all her tasks. First came a small nest of dried moss and shredded linen fibers, materials that would catch a spark easily and burn hot and fast. Next came a handful of very thin, dry twigs gathered from the base of the hazel copse at the edge of the abbey's land, their bark peeling and their wood so light it seemed to weigh nothing at all. These she arranged in a careful teepee over the tinder, leaving small gaps for the air to flow through. Then came slightly larger sticks, the thickness of her little finger, and then a few split pieces of seasoned beechwood that would burn long and steady once the fire was established. She worked without hurry, adjusting the placement of each piece until the structure was balanced and the air passages would clear, because a fire built in haste was a fire that would smolder and smoke and refuse to give its heat to the pot above it. The lighting of the fire required the use of the Abbey's one precious fire steel and a piece of flint that lived in a small wooden box on the highest shelf, out of the reach of damp and curious hands. Sister Clémence struck the steel against the flint with a practiced motion, a sharp downward stroke that produced a shower of orange sparks that scattered across the tinder and died. She struck again and again, each attempt producing the same brief cascade of light and then darkness. On the fifth or sixth strike, a single spark landed in the heart of the dried moss and caught a tiny orange glow that flickered and hesitated and then grew, feeding on the fine fibers and sending up a thin curl of white smoke. Sister Clémence leaned close and blew gently, a soft, steady stream of breath that fed the fledgling flame without overwhelming it, and the glow brightened and spread, licking at the base of the smallest twigs and beginning to crackle with the first sounds of burning wood. She sat back on her heels and watched as the fire established itself, the flames growing taller and stronger, their color shifting from orange to yellow to a pale, dancing white at their tips. The warmth began to radiate outward, touching her face and her hands, and the cold stone of the hearths around, and the still room, which had been as cold as the outside air, began its slow transformation into a place of comfort and purpose. With the fire burning steadily, Sister Clémence turned her attention to the copper pot. She lifted it from the trivet with both hands, feeling its weight and the cold, smooth surface of the metal, and she carried it to the corner where a large earthenware crock held the day's supply of fresh water drawn from the Abbey well. The water in the crock was very cold, cold enough that a thin skin of ice had formed on its surface during the night and had only just melted in the slight warmth of the still room. She used a wooden ladle to transfer the water to the pot, dipping and pouring with a steady rhythm, the water splashing against the copper with a hollow, ringing sound that echoed in the small chamber. She filled the pot to a level she had learned through long experience, enough water to make a generous quantity of tisane, but not so much that the pot would boil over when the heat rose. Then she carried the filled pot back to the hearth, her arms straining slightly with the weight, and she settled it onto the trivet above the growing flames. The waiting began. Sister Clémence pulled the small three-legged stool from its place against the wall and sat down facing the hearth, her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the copper pot and the fire beneath it. This was the part of the work that required nothing from her but patience, the long, slow interval between the lighting of the fire and the first sign of movement in the water. In the summer months, when the kitchen fires were already burning for the preparation of meals and the water in the system was warmed by the sun, the waiting was shorter and less demanding. But in the deep of January, when every drop of water began at the temperature of melting ice, and the stones of the still room had been cold for months, the waiting was a meditation in itself, a discipline of stillness and attention that was as much a part of the work as the gathering of the herbs or the tending of the flames. The fire settled into its rhythm, the flames wrapping themselves around the base of the copper pot and licking up its sides, their color reflected in the rosy metal and creating the illusion that the pot itself was glowing from within. The wood popped and crackled softly, sending up small showers of sparks that swirled in the draught from the chimney and disappeared into the darkness above. Sister Clémence listened to the sounds of the fire and the silence of the water, and she let her breathing slow to match the patient pace of the heating metal. Her mind drifted, not in the sense of losing focus, but in the sense of expanding outward, touching on the memory of other fires in other winters, the face of the old nun who had taught her this work, the taste of the tisane she was about to prepare, the quiet satisfaction of a task done well and without hurry. A small sound broke the silence, a sound so faint that she almost missed it, a tiny, high-pitched ping that came from somewhere deep within the copper pot. It was the first sign, the initial response of the cold metal to the heat of the fire, a microscopic expansion of the copper molecules as they absorbed the warmth and began to pass it inward to the water. Sister Clémence leaned forward slightly, her attention sharpening, and she waited for the next sound. It came after a long interval, another ping, slightly louder than the first, and then another, and then a series of small metallic ticks and creaks that marked the gradual warming of the vessel. The sounds were like a language she had learned to understand over many years, a conversation between the fire and the pot and the water that told her the progress of the heating without any need to lift the lid and look inside. She rose from the stool and moved to the shelves, where the dried herbs for the tisane were stored in their labeled jars. The selection of herbs for this particular preparation was guided by both knowledge and intuition, a combination of what she knew would ease the specific complaints of her patients and what felt right for the mood of the day and the character of the winter light. She chose dried lemon balm first, a generous pinch of the pale green leaves that crumbled easily between her fingers and released a soft citrus scent that seemed to brighten the close air of the still room. Lemon balm was gentle and calming, a friend to anxious minds and restless bodies, and it would bring a note of summer sweetness to the warmth of the tisane. Next, she chose a single dried juniper berry from a small clay pot, a dark, wrinkled sphere that was hard as a pebble and smelled sharply of pine and the deep forest. Juniper was warming and cleansing, a plant that grew on the high, windswept hills and seemed to carry some of that wild vitality into the sheltered space of the infirmary. She crushed the berry between her thumb and the wooden surface of the work table, feeling it crack and release its aromatic oils, and she added the fragments to the small pile of lemon balm. Finally, she reached for the jar of dried angelica root, selecting a thin, pale shaving that curled like a wood shaving and smelled of earth and a faint, musky sweetness. Angelica was a plant of strength and protection, valued for its ability to ward off the weaknesses of winter and support the body's own defenses, and its presence in the tisane would add a deep, grounding note to the lighter flavors of the lemon balm and juniper. She placed the chosen herbs into a small linen bag, a square of unbleached fabric that she had sewn herself from a piece of worn-out sheeting, its edges hemmed with tiny, even stitches. She gathered the corners of the bag and tied them together with a length of hemp twine, leaving a long tail that could be draped over the edge of the pot and used to retrieve the bag when the tisane was ready. The bundle was small and unremarkable, a lump of pale cloth that gave no hint of the flavors and properties contained within, and she set it aside on the work table while she returned her attention to the hearth. The water in the copper pot had begun to make a new sound, a low, rumbling whisper that seemed to come from the very bottom of the vessel. This was the sound of the water molecules beginning to move, agitated by the heat that was now penetrating through the copper and into the liquid itself. Tiny bubbles were forming on the inner surface of the pot, invisible from outside but audible as a soft, continuous hiss that mingled with the crackle of the fire. Sister Clémence watched the surface of the water through the small gap between the pot and its lid, seeing nothing but stillness and the faint reflection of the flames. But she knew from long experience that the water was approaching the point where the first gentle simmer would begin. She waited, her hands resting on her knees, her breathing slow and even, and the still room filled with the patient sounds of heating water and burning wood. The condensation began to form on the small window as the temperature in the room rose. The oiled linen covering the window had been cold enough that the moisture in the warming air began to settle on its surface in a fine grey film that slowly gathered into droplets. Sister Clémence watched the droplets form and grow, each one starting as a barely visible speck of fog, and then swelling into a round, trembling bead that caught the firelight and glowed like a tiny liquid jewel. When a droplet grew heavy enough, it began to slide down the surface of the linen, leaving a clear trail behind it that immediately began to fog over again. The droplets moved at different speeds, some racing down in quick, jerky runs, while others crept so slowly that their motion was almost imperceptible, and their paths crossed and merged and divided in a slow, silent dance that was endlessly variable and endlessly the same. Sister Clémence had spent many hours watching condensation run down that window, in winter and summer, and all the seasons between, and she never tired of the sight. It was a small thing, a thing of no practical importance, but it was beautiful in its quiet way, and it filled the waiting time with a gentle, absorbing occupation. The water in the pot reached the simmer, a state of gentle, persistent motion that was not a full boil, but a soft, rolling movement just below the surface. The sound changed from a whisper to a murmur, a low, continuous burble that filled the still room and seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sister Clémence lifted the copper lid with a folded cloth, releasing a cloud of steam that rose up and spread outward, carrying the clean, neutral scent of hot water. She lowered the linen bag of herbs into the pot, holding it by the long twine tail, and she watched as the fabric darkened and sank, the dried leaves inside beginning to absorb the water and release their stored flavors and properties. She draped the twine over the edge of the pot and replaced the lid, leaving a small gap for the steam to escape. And she settled back onto her stool to wait once more. The waiting now was different from the waiting before, because the water was hot and the herbs were steeping and the transformation was underway. The scent of the tisane began to rise from the gap in the lid, a complex, layered fragrance that combined the sweet lemony brightness of the balm with the sharp, resinous note of the juniper and the deep, earthy warmth of the angelica. The smell filled the still room and then seeped out under the door, traveling into the infirmary hall where the patients lay resting, and where Brother Paul, even in his sleep, turned his head slightly toward the source of the comforting aroma. Sister Clémence breathed in the scent and felt her own shoulders relax, her own mind quiet, her own body acknowledging the simple pleasure of warmth and fragrance on a cold winter afternoon. The steeping continued for a long time, long enough for the fire to burn down from its initial blaze to a steady bed of glowing coals, long enough for the condensation on the window to complete its slow migration and gather in a small puddle on the stone sill. Sister Clémence did not measure the time by any clock or hourglass. She measured it by the deepening of the color that she could see when she lifted the lid and peered inside, and by the richness of the scent that filled the room, and by an internal sense that had developed over decades of practice and told her when the tisane was ready. When that moment arrived, she lifted the linen bag from the pot by its twine tail, allowing it to drain for a moment before setting it aside on a small clay dish to be emptied and washed and dried for another use. The liquid that remained in the copper pot was a pale golden brown color, clear and shimmering in the firelight, and it smelled of summer meadows and ancient forests and the patient care of a woman who had spent her life learning to transform the gifts of the earth into comfort for the sick. She ladled the tisane into 3 clay cups, each one a different shape and size because they had been made by different hands in different years, and she arranged the cups on a small wooden tray. The steam rose from the surface of the liquid in slow, curling ribbons, and Sister Clémence carried the tray through the door that connected the still room to the infirmary hall, stepping from the warm, fragrant enclosure into the larger, cooler space where her patients waited. The grey cat lifted her head as she passed, her nose twitching at the unfamiliar but not unpleasant scent, and Brother Martin opened his eyes and smiled, a slow, tired smile. Sister Clémence moved among the pallets, placing a warm cup into each pair of waiting hands, and she watched as the patients raised the cups to their lips and drank, their faces softening with the simple comfort of warmth and care. The work of the still room was complete, and the long winter afternoon stretched on, quiet and patient and full of the small, necessary kindnesses that made the cold months bearable. The snow had returned in the night, not with any great announcement of wind or storm, but with the same patient, persistent silence that characterized all the weather of that long January in the year 1420. Sister Clémence had known it was snowing even before she rose from her pallet and crossed to the small window of her cell, because the quality of the darkness had changed from the deep, hollow black of a clear winter night to a softer, grayer darkness that seemed to press against the oiled linen with a gentle, muffling weight. When she did look out, wiping the frost from the inside of the fabric with her sleeve, she saw nothing but a wall of white that moved so slowly and so evenly that it was difficult to tell whether the flakes were falling or simply hanging suspended in the air, waiting for some signal to continue their descent. The snow had been falling for hours and would continue to fall for hours more, and the world outside the Abbey walls had been reduced to a small circle of visibility that extended no further than the edge of the cloister garth, and then dissolved into a soft, white void. The effect of this renewed snowfall on the life of the Abbey was to slow everything even further, to draw the community deeper into the interior spaces and the quiet sedentary tasks that could be performed by candlelight and firelight and the pale filtered glow that managed to penetrate the high windows. The infirmary garden was inaccessible now, buried under a fresh layer that would need to settle and compact before any useful work could be done there. The still room fire had been banked for the day because no new preparations were required, and the patients in the infirmary were resting comfortably, their cups of yesterday's tisane long since emptied, and their blankets pulled up to their chins against the pervasive chill. Brother Paul's cough had loosened and become productive, a sign that the hyssop and steam were doing their slow work, and Brother Martin had reported that the warm compresses had eased the ache in his hands enough that he could hold his prayer beads without wincing. The lay sister with the twisted ankle was sitting up and asking for something to occupy her hands, and Sister Clemence had given her a small bundle of wool to card, a mindless, repetitive task that was well suited to a patient who needed rest, but not boredom. For herself, Sister Clemence had a task that she had been putting off for several weeks, a task that required no movement beyond the walls of the Abbey, and no tools beyond those that could be found in the small, dim corner of the scriptorium that was reserved for practical records rather than sacred texts. The task was the winter inventory, the slow, methodical accounting of the dried herbs and stored seeds and medicinal preparations that remained in the infirmary stores, a record that would guide her planning for the coming spring and alert her to any shortages that needed to be addressed before the new growing season began. The inventory was not a spiritual exercise. It was not a work of beauty or devotion, but it was necessary in its own quiet way, a form of stewardship that honored the plants that had given their leaves and flowers and roots and seeds to the care of the community. The scriptorium nook where Sister Clemence kept her ledger was not the main writing room of the Abbey, where the skilled scribes labored over illuminated manuscripts and copied sacred texts onto precious sheets of vellum made from the skins of calves. That room was a place of great importance and strict rules, and Sister Clemence had no business there beyond the occasional delivery of a calming tisane for a scribe whose eyes had grown tired or whose hand had begun to cramp. Her nook was a much humbler space, a shallow alcove carved into the thick wall between the infirmary and the chapter house, just wide enough for a small writing slope and a three-legged stool and a single shelf that held her meager supplies. The alcove had no window of its own, but borrowed a little light from a nearby arrow loop that looked out onto the cloister garth, a narrow vertical slit that admitted a thin blade of grey illumination and did little to warm the cold stone that surrounded her on three sides. In the summer, the alcove was a pleasant refuge from the heat, a cool, shadowed pocket where she could sit and make her notes while the bees hummed in the lavender beyond the wall. In the winter, the alcove was simply cold in a way that seeped through wool and linen and settled into the bones of the hands and made every small movement a conscious effort. She arrived at the alcove carrying a small bundle wrapped in a square of undyed linen, and she set about preparing her workspace with the same patient care she brought to the preparation of a remedy or the tending of a garden bed. The writing slope was a simple board of smooth planed beechwood that could be propped at an angle by a hinged support, creating a comfortable surface for the act of writing. Sister Clemence unfolded the support and settled the board into place, then spread a clean piece of linen over the surface to protect it from any stray drops of ink. She set her bundle on the edge of the slope and untied the twine that held it closed, revealing the contents within: a small clay pot of dried ink, a larger pot of clean water, a square of soft wool for blotting, a small knife with a warm bone handle, a bundle of trimmed goose quills, and the ledger itself, a thin book made of scraped vellum pages stitched between two covers of thin oak board. The ledger was not a beautiful object in the way that the illuminated manuscripts of the main scriptorium were beautiful. Its pages were not perfectly white or evenly trimmed, because they had been made from the less desirable portions of the vellum skins, the edges and the bellies that were too irregular for the sacred texts. Some pages were thicker than others, some had a faint yellowish cast, and a few bore the small dark spots that were the remnants of hair follicles that had not been completely removed in the scraping process. The oak covers were plain and unadorned, darkened by the oils of many hands and scarred with the small scratches and dents of years of use. The stitching that held the pages together was visible along the spine, a series of neat, even stitches made with waxed linen thread that Sister Clemence had renewed herself 2 winters ago, when the original binding had begun to loosen. The ledger was a working object, a tool rather than a treasure, and it was valuable precisely because of its plainness and its durability, and the long, patient record it contained. She opened the ledger to the current page, a sheet of vellum that was about half filled with her neat, careful script. The entries from the previous winter and the past summer's harvest were recorded there, written in a hand that was small and precise and utterly legible. The letters formed with a consistency that came from years of practice and a temperament that valued clarity over flourish. The ink she had used was a dark brownish black, the color of rich earth or old oak bark, and it had been made from oak galls crushed and boiled with iron salts and gum arabic, a recipe that produced a durable, permanent mark that would not fade or wash away. She had made the ink herself in the autumn, gathering the round, hard galls from the oak trees at the edge of the Abbey's wood, and spending a long afternoon in the still room tending the pungent, acrid brew as it simmered and reduced and transformed into the dark liquid that would carry her words across the years. The ink in the small clay pot had thickened slightly during the weeks of cold, its surface developing a faint, rubbery skin that she broke with the tip of her little finger before she began to work. She added a few drops of water from the larger pot, using a small wooden spoon to stir the mixture until it reached the proper consistency, thin enough to flow freely from the quill, but thick enough to leave a clear, dark line on the vellum. The stirring was a slow, circular motion that she performed without thought, her eyes on the ledger, but her attention on the feel of the ink moving against the spoon, the subtle change in resistance that told her when the mixture was ready. The sound of the spoon against the clay pot was a soft rhythmic tapping, a small regular noise that joined the distant whisper of the falling snow and the occasional crackle from the nearest brazier to form the quiet music of the winter scriptorium. The quills required attention before they could be used, because the tips had grown soft and splayed during the weeks of disuse and the cold damp air had not been kind to the delicate keratin. Sister Clémence selected a quill from the bundle, a primary flight feather from a goose that had been plucked and cured and trimmed to a manageable length, its shaft a translucent ivory color and its vein long since stripped away. She took up the small knife and began the slow, precise work of recutting the nib, a process that required a steady hand and a clear eye and an understanding of how the shape of the cut would affect the flow of the ink. She made a long, angled slice to remove the old, worn tip, revealing the fresh, white interior of the shaft. Then she made a shorter, shallower cut to create the point, and a third, very fine cut to split the tip and form the small channel that would hold and release the ink. She worked slowly, pausing after each cut to examine her progress and to brush away the tiny shavings of quill that accumulated on the linen cloth. The knife made a soft scraping sound as it moved through the keratin, a sound that was somewhere between a whisper and a scratch, and the shavings curled away from the blade and fell onto the cloth like tiny, translucent crescent moons. When the quill was prepared to her satisfaction, she dipped the tip into the ink pot and made a few test marks on a scrap of vellum that she kept for this purpose. The lines were thin and even, the ink flowing smoothly from the split nib and leaving a clean, dark trail that dried quickly to a matte finish. She was satisfied, and she set the scrap aside and turned her full attention to the ledger and the task of the inventory. The inventory was not a narrative, but a list, a simple accounting of what remained and what had been used and what would need to be replenished when the spring came and the garden woke from its long sleep. Sister Clémence began with the dried herbs, the jars that she had inspected in the infirmary hall only a few days earlier and whose contents she now recorded in her careful script. She wrote the name of each herb first, using the Latin forms that were common in the medical texts of the time, though she thought of the plants by their familiar French names in her own mind. She wrote mentha for the dried mint that had crumbled so easily and released its cool, refreshing scent. She wrote salvia for the sage with its velvety grey leaves and its sharp, cleansing fragrance. She wrote melissa for the lemon balm that she had used in the tisane and that still had a faint trace of its citrus sweetness even after months in the jar. She wrote botanica for the betony that was so valuable for headaches and nervous complaints, and hyssopus for the hyssop that was even now easing Brother Paul's breathing, and lavandula for the lavender that she loved best of all. After each name she wrote a brief note of the quantity that remained, using a simple system of measures that she had developed over the years and that made sense to her even if it would have confused anyone else. A large jar of dried mint was noted as sufficient, meaning that there was enough to last through the remaining winter months and into the early spring when the first fresh leaves would begin to appear. A smaller jar of dried rosemary was noted as half, meaning that she would need to be sparing in its use, and perhaps consider planting an additional rosemary bush in the sheltered corner when the weather warmed. The dried lavender was noted as plentiful, a word that gave her a small, quiet pleasure each time she wrote it, because the sight of those purple-grey flowers packed tightly into their jar was a promise of sleepless nights, soothed and anxious minds calmed, and the clean, sweet scent of summer preserved against the long, dark months. The act of writing itself was slow and deliberate, each letter formed with care and each word given its proper space on the page. Sister Clemence dipped the quill into the inkpot after every few words, a rhythm that had become so automatic that she no longer thought about it, her hand moving from page to pot and back again with the smooth, unconscious grace of long practice. The quill made a soft, scratching sound as it moved across the vellum, a sound that was different from the scrape of the knife on the quill shaft, lighter and more rapid, a sound that spoke of thoughts becoming visible and knowledge being preserved. The ink went onto the page as a thin, dark liquid that reflected the candlelight for a moment before sinking into the surface of the vellum and becoming permanent. Sister Clemence watched the letters form under her hand and felt the familiar satisfaction of a record kept and a duty discharged, a small, quiet accomplishment that would be seen by no one but herself and perhaps the sister who would inherit her duties when she was gone. After the dried herbs came the seeds, and here the inventory required a different kind of attention because the seeds were the future of the garden in a way that the dried leaves and flowers were not. The dried herbs would be used and gone, their purpose fulfilled in the tisanes and compresses and sachets of the winter months, but the seeds held within them the potential for next summer's plants and the summer after that, and all the summers to come, a chain of life that stretched backward to the first garden that had been planted within these walls, and forward to gardens that would be planted long after Sister Clemence's hands had stilled. The seeds were stored in small linen bags that hung from wooden pegs in the still-room, each bag labelled with a scrap of vellum tied to its drawstring, and Sister Clemence had brought a selection of these bags to the scriptorium nook so that she could count and assess their contents. She opened the first bag, a small pouch of unbleached linen that contained the fennel seeds she had gathered in late August of the previous year. Fennel was a tall, graceful plant with feathery leaves and flat umbels of tiny yellow flowers that attracted bees and butterflies and filled the garden with a sweet, anise-like fragrance. The seeds formed after the flowers faded, small and green at first and then ripening to a pale brown, each one a narrow oval with prominent ridges running its length. Sister Clemence poured a small quantity of the seeds into the palm of her left hand and spread them out with the tip of her right index finger, counting them not one by one but in small groups, estimating the total by the volume and the weight and the feel of them against her skin. The seeds were dry and hard and smelled faintly of licorice, a scent that was subtle now compared to the intense fragrance they had released when she had crushed them fresh between her fingers in the late summer heat. The memory of that harvest rose up as she looked at the seeds, not as a sharp, vivid image, but as a soft, diffuse impression of warmth and light and the particular quality of the air in August when the days were still long and the sun still had real strength. She had spent an afternoon in the garden cutting the ripe fennel heads with a small curved knife and laying them on a clean linen cloth spread in the sunniest corner of the cloister. The seeds had been ready when they turned from green to brown and began to loosen from their sockets, and she had rubbed the dried heads between her palms to release them, the seeds pattering down onto the cloth like tiny, fragrant rain. The smell of fennel had filled the cloister that day, sweet and warm and slightly medicinal, and the bees had come to investigate, buzzing around her hands and then flying away disappointed when they found no nectar. She had sat on the warm stones with the cloth spread before her and the sun on her back and the seeds accumulating in a small brown pile, and she had felt a deep, quiet contentment that had nothing to do with accomplishment and everything to do with simply being present in that moment of summer abundance. She returned the fennel seeds to their bag and pulled the drawstring tight, then opened her ledger to a fresh page and wrote "Funiculum," followed by the note, "4 measures remain." A measure was the amount that would fit in the small wooden scoop she used for dispensing seeds, and 4 measures was sufficient for the spring planting with some left over for the kitchen, where the cooks valued fennel seeds for flavoring breads and broths. She set the bag aside and reached for the next one, a slightly larger pouch that held the coriander seeds, round and pale brown and smelling of citrus and spice. Coriander was an annual plant that grew quickly and produced its seeds in abundance, and she had a generous supply that would easily see her through to the next harvest. She wrote coriandrum, plentiful, and moved on to the next bag. The counting of seeds continued through the long grey afternoon, a slow methodical progression from one linen pouch to the next. There were the small dark seeds of the chamomile, so tiny that they looked like fine dust and had to be handled with particular care. There were the larger triangular seeds of the calendula, curved and pale and strangely beautiful in their stark geometric forms. There were the flat papery seeds of the angelica, each one a small pale disc with a darker center. There were the round black seeds of the mustard, hard as tiny pebbles and smelling of nothing at all until they were crushed, and then releasing a sharp, pungent heat. And there were the seeds of the lavender, so small and light that a single breath could scatter them, each one a tiny dark oval that held within it the potential for a whole plant with its silvery leaves and its purple flowers and its sweet, calming scent. Sister Clémence handled each type of seed with the same patient attention, pouring a small amount into her palm and assessing its condition and estimating its quantity, and then returning it to its bag and making her note in the ledger. The work was repetitive and undemanding, a task that required just enough attention to keep the mind from wandering, but not so much that it became a burden. Her hand moved from bag to page and back again, her quill scratched across the vellum, her ink pot grew slowly emptier, and the list of seeds in the ledger grew longer and more complete. The snow continued to fall beyond the arrow loop, a silent, unceasing presence that wrapped the Abbey in its white embrace and made the small, warm circle of candlelight in the scriptorium nook feel like the only inhabited place in all the world. The afternoon light began to fade, the thin blade of grey from the arrow loop shifting to a deeper, bluer shade that signalled the approach of evening. Sister Clémence's hand had grown cold, despite the proximity of the nearest brazier, and she paused in her writing to tuck her fingers into her opposite sleeve and warm them against her own body. The ink in the pot had thickened again and needed another few drops of water, and she stirred it slowly, with the wooden spoon, while she looked over the page she had filled. The list was long and orderly, a record of abundance and careful stewardship, and she felt the same quiet satisfaction she always felt when a necessary task was completed. The seeds were counted, the ledger was updated, and the garden, though buried under snow and frozen solid in its winter sleep, was already present in these small, dry kernels of potential that waited in their linen bags for the return of warmth and light. She cleaned the quill with a scrap of damp cloth and set it aside to dry, then stoppered the ink pot and wiped its rim clean. The ledger was closed and its oak covers pressed together, the pages within holding their new entries in the dark, patient ink. She gathered her supplies into the linen bundle and tied it with the twine, and she rose from the stool, her back and shoulders stiff from the long hours of sitting still. The scriptorium nook returned to its former emptiness, a shallow alcove in a thick stone wall, and the only evidence of her presence was the faint scent of oak gall ink and the memory of the soft, scratching sound of quill on vellum. Sister Clémence walked slowly back toward the infirmary hall, passing through the cloister where the snow had drifted against the pillars and lay in smooth, white mounds that glowed faintly in the deepening dusk. The inventory was complete, the seeds were waiting, and the long winter night was settling over the Abbey like a second blanket of snow, quiet and patient, and full of the slow, hidden life that would wake when the season turned. The cold on the morning of the dried fish delivery was a different kind of cold from the still, muffled cold of the snowy days that had come before. This cold had teeth, a sharp, biting quality that seemed to find every gap in the wool and linen and settle against the skin with a personal, almost spiteful insistence. The wind had returned in the night, not the howling wind of a true storm, but a steady, persistent breeze that came from the northeast and carried with it the memory of all the frozen plains and dark forests it had crossed on its journey to the walls of St. Geneviève Abbey. The temperature had dropped further, though Sister Clémence had no instrument to measure such things, and could only judge by the way the inside of her nose seemed to freeze when she breathed in deeply, and by the sound of the snow underfoot, which had changed from the soft, wet crunch of the previous days to a high, sharp squeak that was almost like the cry of a small animal. It was a cold that demanded respect, a cold that could not be ignored or wished away, and it was on this morning that word came from the gatekeeper that the cart from the village had arrived with the monthly delivery of dried fish. The dried fish was a staple of the abbey's winter diet, a reliable source of sustenance when the fresh vegetables were long gone, and the livestock had been reduced to the few animals that could be kept alive through the lean months. The fish came from the river that ran through the valley a few miles to the east, caught in the autumn when the water was still open, and then split and salted and hung to dry in the smoke of the village curing sheds. The process transformed the pale, glistening flesh of the fresh fish into something dark and leathery and intensely flavored, a food that required long soaking and slow cooking to become edible, but that provided essential nourishment and a welcome change from the endless round of beans and barley and root vegetables. The abbey had an arrangement with the village, a simple exchange that had been in place for so many generations that no one could remember its origin. The village provided dried fish and occasional other goods, and the abbey provided prayers and a place of refuge, and in times of particular hardship, a share of the garden's surplus herbs and vegetables. The task of receiving the delivery fell to Sister Clemence on this particular morning because the usual recipient, a sturdy lay brother who managed the abbey stores, had come down with a fever 2 days earlier and was resting in the infirmary under her own care. The gatekeeper, an elderly monk named Brother Simon, who had been at the abbey for more than 50 years, and whose chief qualification for his position was that he could no longer manage the physical labor of the fields, had sent a novice to the infirmary with the message that the cart was waiting. Sister Clemence had been in the middle of changing the dressing on the lay sister's twisted ankle, a slow, careful process of unwrapping the linen bandage and checking the swelling and the color of the bruised skin, before rewrapping it with fresh strips of cloth. She finished the task without hurry, because the fish would not spoil in the cold, and the carter would be grateful for a few extra minutes to warm his hands at the small brazier that Brother Simon kept in his gatehouse nook. And then she rose and began to prepare herself for the journey across the courtyard. The preparation for going outside in such cold was a ritual in itself, a sequence of layers and adjustments that she had performed so many times that her hands moved through the motions without any need for conscious direction. First came the thick wool stockings, knitted from the undyed fleece of the abbey's own sheep and worn soft from years of washing and wearing. She pulled them up over her linen understockings and smoothed the fabric so that no wrinkles would press against her skin and create sore spots during the walk. Then came the habit itself, a voluminous garment of heavy dark wool that fell to her ankles and was gathered at the waist with a simple leather belt. The habit was not new. It had been made for her by the community's seamstress many winters ago, and had been patched and mended so many times that the original fabric was now more repair than original. A patchwork of slightly different shades of dark brown and grey that told the story of every tear and every careful stitch. Over the habit went the scapula, a long rectangular piece of wool that hung down the front and back and was worn as a symbol of the yoke of service. And over that went the white linen wimple that covered her hair and neck and framed her face in a stiff, precise oval. The cloak was the final and most important layer, a garment of such weight and substance that it felt less like clothing and more like a small, portable shelter. The cloak had been made from the wool of the abbey's sheep many years before Sister Clemence had arrived at Sainte Geneviève, and it had been passed down through a succession of infirmarians, like a badge of office or a sacred trust. The wool was undyed, a deep, rich brown that was almost black in the shadows, but that glowed with warm, earthy tones when the light caught it. The fabric was thick and dense, woven on a wide loom and then fulled in the abbey's own mill, a process that involved soaking the cloth in water and beating it until the fibers shrank and locked together into a tight, weatherproof mat. The cloak was heavy, so heavy that Sister Clemence's shoulders always dropped slightly when she first put it on, adjusting to the weight that would press down on her for the duration of her time outside. But the weight was a comfort as well as a burden, a solid, reliable presence that wrapped around her and held the warmth of her body close. The smell of the cloak was the smell of winter itself, a complex, layered fragrance that she had come to associate with the cold months and the necessary journeys across the frozen courtyard. The dominant note was lanolin, the natural oil in the sheep's wool that repelled water and gave the fabric its distinctive, slightly greasy feel. The lanolin smelled clean and animal and faintly sweet, a smell that spoke of the living sheep and the grassy fields of summer and the patient work of the shepherds. Beneath the lanolin was the smell of wood smoke, a smell that permeated everything in the abbey during the winter months, and that clung to the fibers of the cloak long after the fires had been banked. The wood smoke smell was acrid and slightly bitter, the ghost of 1,000 fires that had warmed 1,000 cold evenings, and it mingled with the lanolin to create a scent that was uniquely the scent of the cloak and of the winter and of the life that Sister Clemence lived within these stone walls. And beneath even that, there was the faint, clean smell of frost itself, the smell of cold air and frozen water, and the particular purity that came from a world scrubbed clean by snow and ice. She swung the cloak around her shoulders and fastened it at the throat with a simple wooden toggle and loop, a closure that could be managed even with cold, stiffened fingers. The weight settled onto her shoulders, familiar and reassuring, and she pulled the deep hood forward so that it framed her face and extended out past her forehead, creating a small dark cave that would protect her eyes from the glare of the snow and her cheeks from the bite of the wind. The wimple crinkled softly as the hood pressed against it, the starched linen adjusting to the new layer of weight and warmth, and she felt the fabric grow slightly damp where her breath, already visible as a small cloud of white, condensed against the wool. She tucked her hands into the opposing sleeves of the habit, the traditional posture of the enclosed religious, and she felt the warmth of her own body trapped in the small space between her forearms and her chest, a pocket of heat that would sustain her through the walk across the open courtyard. The journey from the infirmary to the main gate required a passage through the cloister walkway and then across the great courtyard, an open space that was exposed to the full force of the wind and that had been transformed by the recent snows into a broad, white expanse broken only by the dark lines of the paths that had been trampled and swept and kept clear for the daily necessities of the community. The cloister walkway was sheltered, its stone arches and heavy roof protecting the passage from the worst of the wind, but the air within the walkway was still cold enough that Sister Clemence could see her breath and feel the chill creeping up through the thin soles of her leather shoes. She had put on her wooden pattens for this journey, the raised platforms of carved alderwood that strapped onto her shoes and lifted her a few inches above the snow and the frozen ground. The pattens made walking slightly awkward, a careful rolling gait that required attention and balance, but they kept her feet dry and added a small measure of insulation between her body and the frozen earth. The sound of the pattens on the stone floor of the cloister was a sharp, hollow clacking that echoed off the arches and announced her passage to anyone who might be listening. She reached the end of the cloister and stepped through the arched doorway that led to the courtyard, and the full force of the winter morning struck her like a physical blow. The wind had been merely a presence in the cloister, a distant sound and a faint movement of the air, but in the open courtyard it was a living thing, a steady, pushing force that pressed against her cloak and tried to find its way through the layers of wool to the warm body beneath. The cold was so intense that it seemed to have a weight of its own, a pressure against her exposed face that made her eyes water and her nose ache and her lips feel stiff and strange. She pulled the hood further forward and ducked her chin toward her chest, narrowing the opening through which the wind could reach her face, and she began the slow, careful walk across the white expanse. The path across the courtyard had been cleared in the early morning by the lay brothers whose duty it was to keep the abbey functioning through the winter months. They had used wooden shovels to cut a narrow channel through the drifts, piling the snow on either side into low walls that rose to knee-height and created a shallow trench through which the community could move without wading through the deep accumulation. The surface of the path was not the bare stone of the courtyard, which would have been too slippery and too cold to walk on safely, but a packed layer of snow that had been trampled down by many feet and was now as hard and smooth as a dirt road in summer. The packed snow crunched under Sister Clemence's pattens, with a sound that was different from the clacking of the cloister stones, a sharp, high-pitched squeak that repeated with every step and created a rhythm that marked her progress across the open space. Crunch, 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 the sound went, each step identical to the one before and the one after, a steady, monotonous beat that seemed to slow time itself and stretch the distance between the cloister door and the distant gate. The walls of snow on either side of the path were studded with small dark objects that had been revealed by the shoveling, a lost wooden spoon, a piece of broken pottery, the frozen remains of a cabbage leaf that had blown from the kitchen midden and been buried in the first snowfall. Sister Clemence noticed these things without really seeing them. her attention focused on the act of walking and the maintenance of her balance on the raised patterns and the careful regulation of her breathing in the bitter air. She had learned long ago that the secret to moving through extreme cold was to find a pace that was slow enough to conserve energy and minimize the amount of frigid air drawn into the lungs, but steady enough to generate the internal heat that would keep the body warm. Walking too fast meant gasping for breath and filling the chest with air so cold it hurt, while walking too slowly meant allowing the cold to seep through the layers and settle into the bones. The right pace was a walking meditation, a rhythm that matched the rhythm of the prayer offices and the rhythm of the seasons and the rhythm of the patient work that filled her days. Halfway across the courtyard, she passed the well. The well was a stone cylinder that rose from the center of the open space, its mouth covered with a heavy wooden lid to prevent snow and debris from falling into the water below. The rope and bucket that usually hung from the iron windlass had been removed and taken inside at the start of the winter because the rope would freeze and become brittle and the bucket would crack if left exposed to the repeated cycles of wet and cold. The windlass itself was coated with a thick layer of frost that had formed from the moisture rising from the well shaft and freezing on contact with the cold iron, and the frost had built up over the weeks into a delicate crystalline structure that looked like white fur or the feathers of some strange winter bird. Sister Clemence paused for a moment beside the well, not because she needed to, but because the pause was part of the rhythm of the journey, a small break in the monotony of the crunching footsteps that allowed her to take stock of her body and the cold and the distance still to go. She looked at the frost on the windlass and thought about the water far below, liquid and dark and cold, but not frozen, protected by the earth that surrounded it and the depth that kept it safe from the worst of the winter's grip. The well water would be drawn later in the day by the lay brothers, who would break the thin skin of ice that formed on the surface overnight and haul up the heavy buckets with numb fingers and reddened faces, and it would be carried to the kitchen and the infirmary and the still room, where it would be heated and used and transformed into the stuff of daily life. She turned away from the well and continued her walk, the gatehouse growing larger and more distinct with each crunching step. The gatehouse was a small, square building that abutted the main gate of the Abbey, a structure of the same grey stone as the rest of the walls, but with a more recent roof of wooden shingles that had weathered to a soft, silvery brown. A thin plume of smoke rose from a chimney at the back of the gatehouse, the only sign of warmth and habitation in the frozen landscape, and Sister Clemence felt her pace quicken slightly at the prospect of even a few moments of relative shelter. The wind seemed to strengthen as she approached the gate, funneling through the narrow passage and tugging at her cloak and her hood and the edges of her wimple. She felt the fabric of the wimple grow stiff against her chin, the moisture from her breath freezing in the cold air and turning the soft linen into a hard, scratchy collar that rubbed against her skin with every movement. This was a sensation she knew well, the gradual transformation of her clothing from a source of comfort to a source of minor irritation. And she accepted it as she accepted all the small discomforts of winter, as the price of moving through a world that was not made for human warmth. The gatehouse door was a heavy slab of oak, reinforced with iron straps, and it opened inward with a groan of cold stiffened hinges when Sister Clemence pushed against it. The interior of the gatehouse was a single small room, barely large enough for the brazier that glowed in the corner, and the stool where Brother Simon sat wrapped in his own voluminous cloak, and the narrow window that looked out onto the track leading from the Abbey to the village. The air inside was warm compared to the courtyard, though it was still cold enough that Sister Clemence's breath continued to form small clouds, and it smelled of burning charcoal and old wool and the faint, fishy scent that always lingered in the gatehouse after a delivery. Brother Simon looked up as she entered, his face a network of deep lines and his eyes pale and watery with age, and he nodded, a slow greeting that required no words. The carter from the village stood near the brazier, a short, broad man wrapped in so many layers of patched and mended wool that he resembled a walking bundle of rags, and he too nodded as Sister Clemence entered, his face red and raw from the wind and his hands extended toward the warmth of the coals. The transaction was conducted in near silence because there was little to say and the cold seemed to discourage unnecessary speech. The carter had brought a large basket woven from split willow branches, and within the basket were the dried fish packed in layers separated by pieces of coarse linen. The fish were flat and stiff and dark, their flesh reduced to a leathery consistency, and their surfaces coated with a fine dust of salt that sparkled faintly in the dim light. They smelled strongly of the sea, though the sea was many days' journey from this inland valley, a sharp, briny scent that cut through the other smells of the gatehouse and filled the small space with the memory of waves and tides and the lives of the fishermen who had pulled these creatures from the water. Sister Clemence inspected the fish with a practiced eye, checking for any signs of mold or spoilage, or the small rust-colored spots that indicated the presence of the mites that sometimes infested dried stores. The fish were in good condition, hard and dry and properly salted, and she nodded her acceptance to the carter. The carter produced a small piece of scraped vellum from somewhere within his layers of wool, a simple receipt that acknowledged the delivery and that Sister Clemence would sign or mark as proof for the Abbey's records. She had brought no ink or quill with her, but Brother Simon kept a small pot of ink and a worn quill in a niche by the window for just such purposes, and she used them to make her mark, a simple cross followed by her initials in a small, neat hand. The ink was thick and sluggish from the cold, and it left a pale, uneven line on the vellum, but it was sufficient for the purpose. The carter tucked the receipt back into his clothing and nodded again, and then he turned and pushed open the gatehouse door and stepped back out into the wind, his business concluded, and his cart waiting to carry him back to the village and the warmth of his own hearth. Sister Clemence lifted the basket of fish. It was heavy, heavier than she'd expected, the weight of the dried flesh and the salt and the woven willow combining into a burden that pulled at her arms and shoulders and made her grateful for the support of the cloak and the layers beneath it. She settled the basket against her hip, adjusting her grip until the weight was balanced and secure, and she nodded her thanks to Brother Simon and stepped back out into the courtyard. The wind had not lessened in the brief time she had spent inside the gatehouse, and it struck her with renewed force as she emerged from the shelter of the stone walls. The cold found the small patch of skin on her cheeks that was not covered by the hood, and it found the narrow gap between her sleeves and her gloves where the skin of her wrists was exposed, and it settled into those places with a sharp, insistent ache. She ducked her head and began the slow walk back across the white expanse, the basket of fish, a heavy, awkward presence that altered her balance and made each step on the wooden patterns a small negotiation with gravity and the slippery packed snow. The return journey was slower than the outward journey had been, burdened as she was with the weight of the basket and the accumulated cold that had settled into her body despite the layers of wool. Her toes, pressed against the hard soles of the pattens, had grown numb and distant, their sensations reduced to a vague awareness of pressure rather than the sharp, specific feeling of cold. Her fingers, curled around the handle of the basket and tucked as far into her sleeves as she could manage, were stiff and clumsy, the joints aching with a dull, persistent throb that she knew would linger long after she returned to the warmth of the infirmary. And her face, the only part of her truly exposed to the elements, felt tight and strange, the skin stretched over her cheekbones and the tip of her nose completely numb, a small dead thing attached to the front of her living face. She did not hurry, because hurrying would only make her breathe harder and draw more of the bitter air into her lungs, and because the basket was heavy and the path was slick and a fall would be both painful and undignified. She walked at the same steady, patient pace she had maintained on the outward journey, the crunch of her pattens on the packed snow marking the slow passage of time and distance. The cloister doorway, when she finally reached it, felt like a reprieve, though the air within the walkway was only marginally warmer than the air outside. The shelter from the wind was the real gift, the sudden cessation of that steady pushing force that had been pressing against her for the entire crossing. She set the basket down on the stone floor and paused for a moment, her breath coming in slow, deep clouds and her heart beating with a steady, reassuring rhythm. The cold was still there, wrapped around her and settled into her clothing, but it was a passive cold now, a cold that would slowly fade as the warmth of the Abbey's interior seeped back into her body. She flexed her stiff fingers and stamped her feet gently to encourage the blood to return to her numb toes, and she felt the familiar tingling ache that marked the transition from frozen to merely cold. The rest of the journey was a matter of short passages and familiar turns, the route from the cloister to the kitchen storeroom where the dried fish would be hung from the rafters alongside the other preserved goods that sustained the community through the winter. The kitchen was warm and busy, filled with the sounds of chopping and the crackle of the great hearth and the low murmur of the lay sisters as they went about their work. Sister Clement delivered the basket to the sister in charge of the stores, a stout, capable woman named Sister Agatha, who had been in the kitchen for 30 years and who knew the contents of every jar and barrel and hanging bundle. Sister Agatha took the basket with a grunt of acknowledgment and set it aside to be unpacked later, and Sister Clemence was free to return to the infirmary and the quiet, warm routine of her own domain. She walked the final passage to the infirmary hall with the basket no longer in her hands and the weight of the cloak still pressing on her shoulders. The warmth of the interior air was beginning to penetrate the layers of wool, and she could feel the stiffness in her face relaxing as the blood returned to her cheeks and nose. The wimple, which had frozen stiff against her chin, was growing soft and damp again as the ice melted and the moisture soaked into the linen. By the time she pushed aside the heavy felted curtain that served as the infirmary door, she was almost warm, or at least no longer actively cold, and the journey across the courtyard was already receding into the past, becoming one more small, unremarkable event in the long, quiet sequence of winter days. The patients were as she had left them, Brother Martin dozing by the fire, and Brother Paul breathing more easily, and the grey cat curled in her usual spot, and Sister Clemence hung her cloak on its peg and settled back into the slow, steady rhythm of the infirmary, the cold of the courtyard fading from her memory like a dream upon waking. The sun appeared in the still-room window as an unexpected visitor, the kind of guest who arrives without announcement and stands quietly in the corner until someone notices and offers a seat. It had been many days since any direct light had penetrated the small high opening in the thick stone wall, days during which the sky had remained a uniform grey that seemed to press down upon the Abbey and smooth out all shadows into a single, flat dimness. The change came without warning in the middle of the morning, when a narrow gap opened in the dense winter clouds and allowed a beam of pale, golden light to slice through the oiled linen and fall upon the opposite wall of the still room like a ribbon of liquid honey poured from an invisible jar. The beam was thin and sharply defined, its edges clean and straight where it passed through the window frame, and it illuminated a rectangle of the stone wall that had been dark for so long that Sister Clemence had forgotten what color the stones were in that particular spot. She had been sitting on the three-legged stool near the cold hearth, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm water that she had brought from the kitchen and that was now cooling rapidly in the chill air of the unheated room. She had come to the still room not for any specific task, but simply to be there, to sit among the jars and the dried herbs and the copper vessels, and to let the quiet familiarity of the space settle her mind after the morning's duties in the infirmary. Brother Paul's cough had returned in the night, a dry, hacking sound that had disturbed his sleep and hers, and she had spent the early hours preparing a fresh inhalation of hyssop and thyme and sitting with him while the steam did its slow work. He was resting now, his breathing easier and his face peaceful, and Sister Clemence had retreated to the still room to sit in the silence and let her own breathing return to its normal rhythm. The appearance of the sunbeam was an unexpected gift, a small, bright interruption in the grey monotony of the winter day, and she set down her cup on the stone floor and turned her full attention to the light. The beam fell upon the highest shelf of the still room's north wall, a shelf that was just below the ceiling, and that required the use of the small three-legged stool to reach. This shelf held the jars that Sister Clemence used least frequently, the herbs and preparations that were potent and precious and needed only in small quantities, or that were so abundant that she rarely had to draw from the stored supply. The jars themselves were a varied collection, each one different in shape and size and color from its neighbors, and the light falling upon them revealed details that were usually lost in the perpetual dimness of the room. The beam illuminated a span of perhaps 2 feet along the shelf, and within that span the jars seemed to wake from their long, dark sleep and show themselves as they truly were. The jar that caught her eye first was a tall, slender container with a narrow neck and a small, flared lip, its surface covered with a glossy glaze of deep amber that glowed like captured sunlight in the beam. The glaze had been applied by a potter whose name was unknown, but whose skill was evident in the even, unbroken surface and the way the color deepened and lightened as it flowed over the curves of the clay. Near the base of the jar, the potter's thumb had pressed into the still soft clay and left a small oval depression, a mark that was invisible in the shadows, but that now stood out clearly as a darker oval within the amber glow. The jar contained the dried yarrow flowers, a plant that Sister Clémence valued for its ability to slow bleeding and ease fevers, and she had not opened it since the autumn, when she had replenished the supply from the summer harvest. The yarrow was a plant of the open fields, its flat clusters of tiny white flowers visible from a distance as pale patches among the grasses, and she remembered the day she had gathered it, a warm afternoon in late July, when the air had been thick with the scent of hay and the sound of grasshoppers. She rose from the stool and moved closer to the shelf, her eyes travelling along the row of jars that the light had revealed. Next to the yarrow jar stood a shorter, wider container with a rough, unglazed surface, the colour of pale terracotta, its texture like fine sandpaper under the fingers. This jar held the dried wormwood, a plant of silvery leaves and intensely bitter taste that Sister Clémence used sparingly and only for the most stubborn digestive complaints. The unglazed surface of the jar had absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, so that the terracotta appeared almost dusty and flat, a muted presence beside the glowing amber of its neighbour. The contrast between the two jars was striking, the yarrow jar bright and warm and welcoming, while the wormwood jar was subdued and reticent, and Sister Clémence thought about how the character of the container seemed to match the character of the plant within, though she knew this was only a fancy and that the potters had given no thought to such things when they shaped the clay. The light continued to move, though its motion was so slow that it could only be perceived by looking away and then looking back. Sister Clémence had watched the sun travel across the still room many times over the years, and she knew that the beam would creep along the shelf for the better part of an hour before it reached the corner and began its descent down the wall. There was no hurry, no need to do anything but stand and observe and let the quiet beauty of the illuminated jars fill her mind. She reached up and touched the base of the yarrow jar with her fingertip, feeling the smooth, cool surface of the glaze and the slight ridge where the potter's wheel had left its mark. The jar was firmly seated on the shelf, its weight reassuring and solid, and she made a decision to take it down and examine its contents in the full light of the beam. The three-legged stool was needed for this task because the shelf was high and Sister Clémence was not a tall woman. She fetched the stool from its place by the hearth and positioned it carefully beneath the shelf, testing its stability on the uneven stone floor before she stepped up. The stool was old and worn, its seat polished to a dark sheen by years of use, and its legs slightly splayed from bearing the weight of countless risings and sittings. Sister Clémence placed her left hand on the edge of the shelf for balance and reached up with her right hand to grasp the yarrow jar, her fingers curling around its narrow neck and lifting it gently from its resting place. The jar was heavy, heavier than it looked, and she brought it down slowly, cradling it against her chest with both hands as she stepped carefully off the stool and back onto the solid floor. She carried the jar to the small work table that stood beneath the window, where the sunbeam fell directly upon the wooden surface and created a pool of warm golden light. She set the jar in the center of this pool and sat down on the stool she had moved from the hearth, positioning herself so that she could see the jar clearly and also watch the slow progress of the light across the shelf above. The jar's amber glaze seemed to come alive in the direct sunlight, the color deepening and brightening until it was almost translucent, and the small irregularities in the surface that were invisible in shadow now stood out as a landscape of tiny bumps and hollows. The potter's thumbprint near the base was a dark, oval depression that caught the light and held it, a small pool of deeper amber within the general glow. Sister Clémence broke the wax seal that secured the linen cover over the jar's mouth, the brittle wax cracking and falling away in small fragments that she collected in her palm. The linen beneath was stretched tight and tied with a length of hemp twine, and she worked the knot loose with her fingernails and lifted the cover away. The scent of yarrow rose from the open jar, a dry, herbaceous smell that was slightly bitter and slightly sweet, and that carried with it the memory of the summer fields and the warm, buzzing air of July. She tilted the jar and poured a small amount of the dried flowers onto the table, where they scattered across the wooden surface and caught the light in a way that made her catch her breath. The yarrow flowers were tiny, each one no larger than a grain of barley, and they had dried to a pale, buttery yellow that was the brightest color Sister Clémence had seen in weeks. In the direct sunlight, the yellow seemed to glow from within, as if each tiny flower had captured a piece of the summer sun and held it through the long, dark months, waiting for this moment to release it back into the world. The individual flower heads were flat and round, composed of many even tinier florets that clustered together in a dense, intricate pattern, and their surfaces were slightly fuzzy, covered with a fine, pale down that softened their outlines and caught the light in 1,000 tiny points. Sister Clemence picked up one of the flower heads and held it close to her eye, marveling at the complexity of its structure, the way the small, tubular florets were arranged in a perfect geometric spiral that seemed to follow some hidden law of order and beauty. The yellow was not uniform but varied from a pale, creamy shade at the center to a deeper, richer gold at the edges, and the contrast with the white tabletop and the grey stone walls made it seem almost impossibly vivid. She sat for a long time with the yarrow flowers spread before her, the sunbeam warming her hands and the side of her face, and the scent of the dried herb filling the still room. The light was a gift, a small reprieve from the grey monotony of the winter, and she received it with the same quiet gratitude she brought to all the small mercies of her enclosed life. She thought about the yarrow plants growing in the garden, now buried under the snow and frozen solid in their winter sleep, and she thought about the roots that held fast in the dark earth, waiting for the warmth that would wake them. The flowers on the table before her were the ghosts of that summer growth, preserved and stored against the needs of the winter, and they carried within them the memory of the sun and the rain and the patient work of the gardener who had tended them. The light moved on. Sister Clemence had been watching it from the corner of her eye, noting how the edge of the beam had crept across the shelf above, leaving the yarrow jar's former resting place in shadow and illuminating a new set of containers. The jar that now stood in the center of the light was a squat, round vessel with a wide mouth and a fitted cork stopper, its surface covered with a greenish-grey glaze that had a matte, slightly rough texture. This jar held the dried violet leaves, a remedy that Sister Clemence prepared in the early spring when the violets bloomed in the sheltered corners of the garden and the woods beyond the Abbey walls. The leaves were broad and heart-shaped, and they dried to a soft dark green that retained a faint trace of their fresh, slightly sweet fragrance. The jar was almost full, because violet leaves were used only occasionally, most often in a soothing tea for patients who suffered from dry, irritated throats, or who simply needed something gentle and calming to drink before sleep. The beam continued its patient journey, and Sister Clemence continued to watch. She had returned the yarrow flowers to their jar and sealed it carefully, setting it aside on the table where it would wait until she was ready to climb the stool again and return it to its place on the high shelf. The sunbeam now illuminated a small, delicate jar of pale clay that held the dried marjoram, an herb that she used sparingly for its warming, comforting properties, and that she always associated with the kitchen garden and the smell of baking bread. Beyond the marjoram jar, the light touched the edge of a larger container that held the dried comfrey leaves, their broad, hairy surfaces reduced to brittle, dark fragments that would be soaked and applied as poultices to bruises and sprains and the aching joints of the elderly. And beyond that, just catching the very edge of the light, was the jar of dried lavender, the jar that Sister Clemence loved best of all, its purple-grey flowers visible as a soft, muted glow through the pale clay of the container. The lavender jar drew her eye and held it, even though it stood at the very margin of the light and was only partially illuminated. The color of the dried flowers was visible through the thin walls of the jar, a soft, dusty purple that was the color of twilight in summer or the shadows under the olive trees in the garden. Sister Clemence did not take the lavender jar down from the shelf because she had examined its contents only a few days earlier and knew that they were in perfect condition, dry and fragrant and ready for use. But she looked at it for a long time, letting her eyes rest on the familiar shape and the hint of color within, and she felt the same quiet comfort that she always felt in the presence of lavender, a sense of calm and order and the patient continuity of the seasons. The light continued to move, and Sister Clemence continued to sit. The still room was quiet except for the faint, distant sounds of the Abbey going about its daily round, the soft shuffle of feet in the passage outside, and the muffled ringing of a bell somewhere in the depths of the building. The sunbeam had travelled perhaps 6 inches across the shelf in the time she had been sitting there, leaving the marjoram jar in shadow, and now falling fully upon the jar of comfrey leaves. The comfrey jar was the largest on the shelf, a heavy utilitarian vessel with thick walls and a sturdy lid, and its surface was covered with a plain brown glaze that had no beauty or distinction. But the light transformed it, as light transforms everything it touches, revealing the subtle variations in the glaze, and the small circular marks left by the potter's wheel and the faint ghostly reflection of the window in the glossy surface. Even the plainest things became beautiful in the right light, and Sister Clémence thought about how this was true of the garden as well, how the most humble plants revealed their hidden grace when the sun fell upon them at the right angle and the right moment. The beam reached the end of the shelf and began to spill over the edge, falling onto the stone wall below and creating a narrow vertical stripe of gold that descended slowly toward the floor. Sister Clémence watched the stripe lengthen, marking the passage of time in a way that was more reliable than any clock or bell. She knew that when the light reached the floor and began to spread into a pale, diffuse pool, the sun would be approaching its brief midday height, and the beam would soon fade as the clouds closed in again. The weather had not truly changed. This was only a temporary break in the winter's grey dominion, and the sun would retreat behind the clouds and leave the still room to its accustomed dimness. But for now, the light was here, and Sister Clémence was here to receive it. She rose from the stool and picked up the yarrow jar, carrying it back to the shelf and climbing the stool once more to return it to its place. The jar settled into the slight depression it had worn in the wood over the years, a small circular mark that was invisible in the shadows, but that her fingers knew by touch. She stepped down and moved the stool aside, then returned to her place by the work table, and stood looking at the shelf and the jars and the fading beam of light. The wormwood jar was in shadow now, its pale terracotta surface barely visible against the dark stone, and the lavender jar had retreated into the dimness at the far end of the shelf. Only the comfrey jar still caught the light, its plain brown glaze glowing softly as the beam narrowed and weakened. The clouds closed, as she had known they would. The rectangle of light on the wall shrank and faded, the golden stripe on the stone floor dissolved into grey, and the still room returned to its winter dimness. But the memory of the light remained, a warmth behind Sister Clémence's eyes and a sense of having witnessed something small and beautiful and utterly ordinary. The jars on the shelf were invisible now, their shapes and colours swallowed by the shadows. But she knew they were there, waiting in the darkness with their stored summer and their patient readiness. She picked up her cup of now cold water and left the still room, returning to the infirmary hall where the patients dozed and the fire crackled and the grey cat slept on, and the quiet rhythm of the winter day continued, unchanged and unhurried. The change began not as a sight, but as a sound, a small, irregular punctuation in the deep silence of the winter garden that was so faint and so unexpected that Sister Clémence did not trust her ears the first time she heard it. She had been standing at the gate in the early morning, her breath forming slow clouds in the air and her hands tucked into her sleeves against the familiar cold, and she had been listening to the nothing that was the garden's winter voice, the vast, soft absence of sound that had been her companion for so many weeks. And then, from somewhere to her left, near the corner where the infirmary roof met the garden wall, there came a single, distinct sound that was out of place in the frozen world, a soft, wet plink that hung in the still air for a moment and then was gone. She turned her head toward the sound, her attention sharpening, and she waited. The silence returned, thick and heavy and seemingly unchanged, and she began to think that she had imagined it, that the long weeks of winter had finally played a trick on her ears and made her hear something that was not there. But then it came again, a second plink, slightly louder than the first, and then after a longer pause a third, and Sister Clémence understood that what she was hearing was the sound of water dripping from the eaves. The sun had been visible for a short time the previous afternoon, a pale disk behind the thinning clouds, and though the air had remained cold, the stone slates of the roof had absorbed just enough of that weak warmth to melt a thin layer of the snow that had been sitting on them since the first storms of January. The meltwater had trickled down to the edge of the roof and gathered there, and now, in the colder air of the morning, it was releasing its hold one drop at a time, falling to the snow below with a sound that was as gentle as it was momentous. A thaw, even the smallest and most tentative thaw, was an event in the deep of winter, a shift in the order of things that was felt as much as it was observed. The temperature had not risen enough to be noticeable on the skin. The air still bit at Sister Clémence's cheeks and nose with the same sharp teeth it had shown for weeks, and the snow on the ground remained white and apparently unchanged. But the sound of the dripping water told a different story, a story of hidden warmth and gradual transformation, a story that the garden had been waiting to tell for a long time. Sister Clémence stood at the gate and listened to the irregular rhythm of the drips, each one a small liquid note in the frozen silence, and she felt something shift in her own interior landscape, a loosening of the patient tension that had held her through the darkest weeks of the year. She decided to walk the garden paths, not with any specific task in mind, but simply to observe, to see what else the slight warming had revealed. The snow underfoot was different today, and she noticed the change in the first few steps she took from the gate toward the central path. For weeks, the snow had crunched under her shoes with a high, sharp squeak, the sound of frozen crystals grinding against each other without yielding. This morning, the sound was lower and softer, a wet, squelching noise that spoke of snow that was beginning to compact and melt at its base, releasing the moisture it had held locked in its crystalline structure. Her shoes sank into the surface more deeply than they had before, and when she lifted her foot, she left behind a dark, wet print that filled slowly with water, seeping up from the saturated layer beneath. The snow was changing, losing its dry, powdery character and becoming something denser and heavier, something that was no longer quite snow and not yet water, but a transitional substance caught between the two states. She walked first to the sheltered corner where the lungwort grew against the south wall, the place where the faint warmth of the stone had always kept the snow a little shallower than elsewhere. The lungwort leaves were more visible today, their dark green surfaces emerging from the retreating white cover like small islands appearing as a tide receded. The snow around the base of the wall had pulled back a few inches, leaving a dark wet line on the stone where the moisture had soaked into the mortar, and the air in this corner held a faint, earthy smell that had been absent for months. The smell of wet soil and decaying leaves and the slow, patient chemistry of the ground beginning to stir. Sister Clémence knelt and touched the exposed soil with her bare fingers, and it was cold. Still very cold, but it was no longer frozen hard as iron. Her fingertips sank into the surface a tiny fraction of an inch, meeting a slight give that had not been there the last time she had checked, and she felt the moisture cling to her skin and begin to numb her fingertip with its lingering chill. She rose and continued her walk, moving along the eastern side of the garden where the medicinal beds lay under their blankets of straw and snow. The wattled edging was more visible now, the woven willow branches emerging from the shrinking drifts, like the bones of some buried creature slowly being exhumed by the patient work of the thaw. The straw mulch on the comfrey bed had darkened further, saturated with the meltwater that was percolating down through the snow, and it lay in wet, matted clumps that smelled of rot and earth and the faint sweet scent of the comfrey roots beneath. Sister Clémence did not disturb the mulch, because the roots were still dormant and would need its protection for many weeks yet. But she noted the change in its appearance and filed the information away in the mental record she kept of the garden's slow progression through the seasons. The sound of dripping accompanied her as she walked, not a constant noise but an intermittent one, a sporadic plinking that came from different directions as the sun, still hidden behind the high clouds, shifted its faint warmth across the roof and released new pockets of meltwater. The drips fell from the eaves of the infirmary and from the edge of the cloister roof, and from the bare branches of the old quince tree in the corner, each drop a small individual event that marked the boundary between the frozen world that had been and the wetter world that was slowly, patiently emerging. The rhythm of the dripping was irregular and unpredictable, a random pattern that defied any attempt to anticipate the next sound, and this unpredictability held Sister Clémence's attention in a way that a steady, regular sound would not have done. She found herself pausing between steps, listening for the next drop, and then moving on when it came, her progress through the garden becoming a kind of duet with the voice of the thaw. The rosemary bush, which she had covered with an upturned clay pot at the start of the winter, drew her to the south wall where it grew in the shelter of the warm stones. The clay pot was visible now as a distinct shape emerging from the snow, its rounded top and curved sides revealed by the melting that had occurred around its base. The dark, wet ring she had noticed earlier had expanded, and the terracotta of the pot was stained a deeper, richer red where the moisture had soaked into its porous surface. Sister Clémence knelt beside the pot and placed her hands on its curved sides, feeling the cold, damp clay and the faint, almost imperceptible warmth that radiated from the stone wall behind it. She lifted the pot carefully, using both hands and a slow, steady motion, and set it aside on the wet snow. The rosemary beneath was a revelation, a shock of green in a world that had been white and grey and brown for so long. The plant was a small shrub about 18 inches high, its woody stems branching out from a central crown and its narrow, needle-like leaves still attached and still green, though their colour had deepened from the bright silvery green of summer to a darker, more subdued shade that spoke of endurance and patience. The leaves were slightly curled, their edges rolled inward to conserve moisture and protect the delicate tissues from the cold, and they were covered with a fine, pale bloom that gave them a dusty, muted appearance. Sister Clémence reached out and touched one of the leaves, feeling its rough, resinous surface and the faint give of the living tissue beneath. The leaf was cold but not frozen, flexible and alive, and when she crushed it gently between her thumb and forefinger, it released a sharp, clean, unmistakable fragrance that cut through the cold air like a memory of summer. The scent of rosemary was one of the defining smells of Sister Clémence's life, a smell that she associated with the garden in high summer, and with the dried bundles hanging in the still room, and with the savoury dishes that emerged from the kitchen on feast days. To encounter that smell in the middle of the winter garden, rising from a living plant that had survived the deep cold under nothing more than a clay pot and a blanket of snow, was to feel a small, private joy that she would not have been able to explain to anyone who did not share her particular vocation. She knelt beside the rosemary for a long time, breathing in the scent and looking at the dark green leaves and the sturdy grey stems, and she felt a deep, quiet gratitude for the resilience of this plant, and for the simple fact of its survival. The rosemary would need the pot replaced for the coming nights, because the thaw was only a temporary reprieve, and the hard cold would certainly return before the true spring arrived. But for this moment it was enough simply to see it and to know that it had made it through the worst of the winter. She replaced the clay pot carefully, settling it back over the rosemary and pressing its rim into the wet snow to create a seal that would hold in whatever warmth the stone wall provided. Then she rose and brushed the snow from her knees and continued her slow circuit of the garden, her ears tuned to the intermittent dripping and her eyes noting every small change that the thaw had revealed. The stone bench at the south end of the garden had lost its smooth, loaf-like covering of snow, and its grey surface was now visible as a dark, wet slab that gleamed dully in the diffuse light. The snow that remained on the bench was patchy and irregular, clinging to the corners and the crevices where the stone was coldest, and the meltwater had pooled in a slight depression near the centre, creating a small, shallow puddle that reflected the pale sky and the bare branches of the quince tree above. The quince tree drew her attention next, because the change in the weather had revealed details that had been hidden under the snow for weeks. The tree was old, older than anyone in the Abbey could remember, and its trunk was thick and gnarled and covered with a rough, scaly bark that was the colour of old leather. The branches spread out in a crooked, asymmetrical shape that spoke of years of wind and weather, and the patient, stubborn growth of a living thing that had no choice but to endure whatever the seasons brought. The snow that had been sitting on the branches was melting now, releasing small clumps of white that fell to the ground with soft, wet thuds, and the bare wood beneath was dark with moisture and beginning to show the faint silvery sheen of the living tissue beneath the bark. Sister Clémence approached the tree and stood beneath its spreading branches, looking up at the network of twigs and smaller branches that divided and subdivided against the grey sky. The buds were there, though they were so small and so tight that they were almost invisible, tiny brown nubs at the tips of the branches that held within them the potential for leaves and flowers and fruit. They would not open for many weeks yet, not until the soil had warmed and the days had lengthened and the threat of hard frost had passed. But they were present and waiting. A promise written in the silent language of the tree. Sister Clémence reached up and touched one of the lower branches with her bare hand, pressing her palm against the cold, wet bark and feeling the texture of the wood and the faint, slow pulse of life that moved beneath the surface. The bark was cold, of course, as cold as the air and the snow and the frozen ground, but it was not the bitter, hostile cold of deep winter. There was a subtle difference that she could feel, but not describe, a slight softening of the chill that suggested the tree was no longer locked in the deepest phase of its dormancy. The sap was not yet rising. That would not happen until the soil temperature climbed above a certain threshold and the roots began to send water and nutrients upward toward the waiting buds. But the tree was no longer in the state of suspended animation that had held it through the darkest weeks. It was waking, slowly and tentatively, responding to the faint signals of the changing season with a patience that matched Sister Clémence's own. She left her hand on the branch for a long moment, feeling the cold seep into her palm and the moisture from the wet bark soak into her skin. And then she let go and stepped back, leaving the quince tree to its slow, private awakening. The dripping continued as she walked back toward the gate, the sound following her like a quiet companion that had been waiting for this moment to make itself known. The snow underfoot was becoming slushy now, especially in the areas where the faint sun had reached through the clouds and warmed the surface just enough to create a thin layer of meltwater. Her shoes sank into the slush with a wet, sucking sound, and the cold moisture began to seep through the leather and into her wool stockings, a sensation that was familiar from the early springs of years past and that she accepted as part of the cycle. The path back to the gate was marked by her own footprints from the outward journey, and she noticed that they had changed since she made them, the sharp defined edges softening and blurring as the snow melted and refroze and melted again. The prints were filling with water now, small dark pools that reflected the grey sky and the bare branches and the slow, patient figure of the nun who walked among them. At the gate, she paused and turned to look back at the garden one more time. The scene was different from the one she had looked upon every day for so many weeks, though the difference was subtle and would have been invisible to anyone who had not been watching with the close, patient attention that she brought to this place. The snow was still white, still covered the raised beds and the wattle edging and the stone bench, but it was a wetter white now, a white that was beginning to show the dark shapes of the things beneath. The sound of dripping was the garden's new voice, a voice that spoke of transition and change and the slow, inevitable return of warmth. The rosemary was safe under its clay pot. The quince tree was stirring in its ancient, patient way, and the roots of the comfrey and the betony and the lavender were holding fast in the softening soil, waiting for the signal that would tell them it was time to grow. Sister Clémence pulled the heavy door open and stepped through, leaving the garden to its dripping and its melting and its slow, quiet awakening. The sound of the water followed her for a few steps into the passage, then faded as the thick stone walls closed around her and returned her to the familiar silence of the Abbey's interior. But the memory of the sound stayed with her, a small liquid rhythm that played in the back of her mind as she walked through the cloister and into the infirmary hall, and back to the quiet, warm routine of her daily duties. The thaw was only beginning, a temporary reprieve that would almost certainly be followed by more cold and more snow before the true spring arrived. But it was a beginning nonetheless, a first small step on the long, slow journey toward the green months that lay somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the grey horizon of February. The day had arrived without a name. One of those winter days that sits precisely at the midpoint between the deep freeze of January and the first stirrings of February. A day that offers no obvious sign of change, but carries within it a subtle shift that can only be felt by those who have spent many winters paying close attention. The air was still cold, cold enough that Sister Clémence's breath formed clouds, and the snow in the garden remained deep and unbroken. But there was a quality to the cold that had altered by a single, almost imperceptible degree. It was no longer the biting, aggressive cold that sought out every gap in the wool and linen and settled against the skin with hostile intent, but a calmer, more patient cold that seemed willing to share the world with the living things that inhabited it. The wind had dropped days ago and had not returned, and the sky had settled into a high, pale grey that was brighter than the low, heavy clouds of the previous weeks, and that seemed to hold the promise of longer days even if it could not yet deliver any real warmth. Sister Clémence had come to the garden in the middle of the afternoon, after the hour of none and before the preparations for the evening meal, a time of day when the light was already beginning its slow retreat toward the horizon, but still held enough strength to illuminate the white expanse and cast the long blue shadows that were the signature of winter afternoons. She had no task to perform in the garden, no snow to brush from the straw mulch, and no parsnips to dig from the frozen earth, and no plants to check for signs of frost damage. The garden was still sleeping, and it would continue to sleep for many weeks yet, and there was nothing that needed her hands or her attention. but she felt a pull toward the garden nonetheless, a quiet, insistent impulse that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the need to sit in the presence of the sleeping plants and let her mind wander through the beds and the paths and the possibilities of the season to come. The stone bench against the south wall was her destination, the same bench that had spent the winter buried under a smooth, rounded drift of snow shaped like a loaf of bread. The recent slight shift in the weather had been enough to settle the snow and compact it, and the bench was now visible as a dark horizontal shape beneath a thinner layer of white that had melted and refrozen into a crusty, uneven surface. Sister Clemence brushed the snow away with her sleeve, revealing the grey granite beneath, and she sat down on the cold stone with the same patient acceptance she brought to all the discomforts of winter. The cold of the bench seeped through her wool habit and her linen undergarments almost immediately, a slow, penetrating chill that settled into her thighs and her lower back and made itself at home. She did not mind the cold, or rather she had learned over many winters to accept it as the price of sitting still in the garden in January, and she tucked her hands into her opposing sleeves and let her gaze travel out across the white expanse of the sleeping beds. The garden lay before her like a blank page, a smooth, white surface that held no marks or signs of the life that waited beneath. The raised beds were visible as gentle mounds in the snow, their wattle edgings buried and their shapes softened by the weight of the winter's accumulation. The central path was a shallow depression that ran from the gate to the bench, a faint suggestion of a line that would guide her feet when the snow melted and the bare earth was revealed once more. The lavender bed at the far end of the western side was a low, rounded hump beneath its bracken covering, and the sheltered corner where the parsnips and the lungwort waited was a pocket of deeper shadow where the angle of the walls held the cold and the stillness in a tight embrace. Nothing moved in the garden, nothing made a sound, and the only sign that the world beyond the wall still existed was the distant, muffled call of a crow from somewhere in the woods beyond the Abbey's fields. Sister Clemence sat on the cold bench and let her mind begin its slow, patient walk through the garden of the coming spring. This was a practice she had developed over many winters, a way of keeping the garden alive in her thoughts, even when it was buried and frozen and utterly still. It was not a form of planning in the sense of making lists or drawing diagrams or calculating the number of seeds needed for each bed, though those tasks had their place in the ledger and the seed bags and the quiet afternoons in the scriptorium nook. This was something different, a kind of mental gardening that required no tools and left no marks, and served no practical purpose beyond the simple satisfaction of imagining the green that would come when the season turned. She began with the bed nearest the gate on the eastern side, the bed where the comfrey grew. In her mind's eye the snow melted away, and the straw mulch was raked aside, and the dark, rich soil was exposed to the pale light of early spring. The comfrey crowns, which now slept frozen and still beneath the weight of winter, began to stir and send up their first tentative shoots, small furled leaves of deep green that pushed through the soil and unfolded slowly in the warming air. The leaves would be broad and hairy and rough to the touch, and they would grow quickly once the soil warmed, spreading outward from the central crown and creating a dense green mound that would eventually reach her knees. The comfrey was a reliable plant, a plant that asked for little and gave much in return, its leaves useful for poultices and its roots valuable for the deep, stubborn coughs that settled into the chest and refused to loosen their grip. Sister Clemence imagined the feel of the leaves under her fingers, the rough, sandpapery texture and the cool, moist weight of them, and she imagined the small bell-shaped flowers that would appear in the summer, pink and purple and white, nodding on their short stems and attracting the bees that would come from the hives kept by the lay brothers in the far corner of the Abbey's land. Her mind moved on to the next bed, the betony bed, and she saw the same transformation taking place there. The betony was slower to wake than the comfrey, its leaves emerging later and its flowering spikes not appearing until the height of summer, but it was a patient plant that suited a patient gardener. She imagined the dark green leaves with their scalloped edges and their faint, pleasant scent, and she imagined the tall spikes of purple flowers that would rise above the foliage and sway in the warm breeze. The betony was a plant of calm and comfort, a remedy for the anxious thoughts that sometimes plagued the patients who lay too long in the infirmary, with nothing to do but think and worry, and she was grateful for its presence in the garden and for the quiet work it did to ease the minds of those who suffered. Her mental walk continued down the eastern side, past the hyssop with its woody stems and its intensely blue flowers, past the lemon balm that would spread and fill its bed with the sweet citrus scent that always made her think of summer afternoons and the sound of bees, past the angelica with its tall, stately stalks and its large umbels of greenish-white flowers that seemed to belong to an older, wilder world than the orderly beds of the infirmary garden. She paused at each bed and imagined the plants as they would be in the coming season, not as a gardener making plans, but as a visitor walking through a garden that already existed, a garden that was as real in her mind as the frozen white expanse before her eyes. The sheltered corner at the south end of the garden drew her attention next, the place where the south wall met the east wall and created a pocket of warmth that was a few degrees gentler than the rest of the enclosure. In her mind's eye, the snow melted away from this corner first, revealing the dark soil and the pale crowns of the parsnips that had been left in the ground through the winter. The parsnips would be harvested in the early spring, before they began to send up new growth and turn woody and bitter, and she imagined the satisfaction of pulling them from the softening earth and carrying them to the kitchen, the last gift of the previous year's garden before the new season began in earnest. The lungwort would be waking too, its spotted leaves uncurling from their tight winter sleep and spreading out to catch the pale spring light. The leaves would be smaller and more tender than the tough, overwintered foliage that had survived the cold, and they would be a welcome sight, a sign that the garden was stirring and that the long wait was nearly over. The western side of the garden was next, the beds that held the chamomile and the lady's mantle and the wormwood and the lavender. The chamomile would be the first to show signs of life, its low, feathery leaves pressing up through the soil and spreading into a dense green mat that would eventually be covered with the small, daisy-like flowers that smelled of apples and calm. Sister Clemence imagined kneeling beside the chamomile bed and brushing her fingers through the foliage, releasing the sweet, familiar scent and feeling the fine, soft texture of the leaves against her skin. The lady's mantle would follow, its pleated leaves unfurling like small green fans and catching the morning dew in perfect round droplets that glittered like jewels in the early light. The wormwood would be slower, its silvery leaves emerging later and growing into a tall, graceful plant that seemed to glow with its own pale light, even on the dullest days. And then there was the lavender, the bed at the far end of the western side where the plants had slept under their bracken covering and waited out the long, cold months. In her mind's eye, Sister Clemence removed the bracken and the straw and revealed the grey, woody stems of the lavender plants, stems that looked dead but were not, their living hearts tucked deep inside and waiting for the signal to wake. The first signs of life would be small, tiny buds of silvery green that appeared at the tips of the bare branches, so small that they could easily be missed by anyone who was not looking for them. But Sister Clemence would be looking, and she would see them, and she would feel the quiet, familiar gladness that came with the knowledge that the lavender had survived another winter and would soon fill the garden with its purple flowers and its sweet, calming scent. She imagined the bees returning to the lavender, their bodies heavy with pollen, and their wings making the low, contented hum that was the sound of summer itself. And she imagined the patients in the infirmary asking for sprigs of lavender to place on their pillows, and she imagined the long, slow afternoons of the harvest when she would cut the flowering stems and tie them into bundles and hang them from the rafters of the stillroom to dry. Her mind moved on from the individual beds and began to consider the garden as a whole, the relationships between the plants and the paths and the walls that enclosed them. She thought about the way the chamomile spread and needed to be kept in check, its runners creeping outward and colonizing the spaces between the beds if she was not vigilant. She thought about the angelica and its tendency to self-seed, scattering its progeny across the garden and appearing in unexpected places where she would have to decide whether to let it grow or pull it up and restore the order of the beds. She thought about the horehound, a plant that grew in a small patch near the gate and that had a way of spreading if left to its own devices, its woolly grey-green leaves and its bitter medicinal taste making it useful for coughs, but its enthusiastic growth making it a plant that required a firm hand. She considered whether the horehound had spread too far the previous summer, and whether she should move some of it to a different location, perhaps to the edge of the sheltered corner where it could grow without crowding the more delicate herbs. The tansy was another plant that occupied her thoughts, a tall aromatic herb with ferny leaves and clusters of yellow button-like flowers that she used sparingly and with caution. The tansy grew near the well in the courtyard, not in the infirmary garden proper, but she had been thinking about moving it for some time because its strong pungent scent seemed to attract every insect in the vicinity, and she was not entirely sure that its presence so close to the water source was wise. The well water was precious, and anything that might compromise its purity was a matter for careful consideration. She turned the question over in her mind, examining it from different angles, without any sense of urgency or need for resolution, because the ground was still frozen, and no planting or moving could be done for many weeks yet. The thinking itself was the work, the slow, patient turning of possibilities, and the quiet satisfaction of imagining the garden as it might be. The light continued to change as she sat on the cold bench, the pale grey of the afternoon deepening toward the softer, bluer grey of the approaching evening. The shadows of the walls stretched further across the snow, reaching toward the center of the garden and blurring at their edges as the light grew more diffuse. Sister Clémence felt the cold of the stone bench more acutely now, a deep, settled chill that had penetrated through the layers of wool and was beginning to make her legs feel heavy and distant. But she did not rise, not yet, because there was something in the quality of the light that held her in place, a faint, almost imperceptible lengthening that spoke of the slow turn of the earth and the gradual return of the sun. The winter solstice had passed more than a month ago, and the days had been lengthening ever since, though the change was so small and so gradual that it could not be perceived from one day to the next. But if you paid attention over the span of weeks, if you noted the time when the light faded from the high window in the infirmary, or when the shadows reached a certain stone in the cloister walkway, you could feel the shift. The afternoons were no longer cut short so abruptly. The darkness no longer rushed in with quite the same greedy haste. The light lingered, just a little, just enough to notice if you were the kind of person who noticed such things. Sister Clémence was that kind of person, and she sat on the cold bench and watched the slow, beautiful fading of the winter afternoon, and felt the quiet promise that the light carried. The 100 Years' War, that long and distant conflict that had shaped the world beyond the Abbey walls for as long as anyone could remember, was a rumor in the winter air, a thing that happened somewhere else to people she did not know. News of battles and treaties and the shifting fortunes of kings reached the Abbey only occasionally, carried by travelers who stopped for shelter or by the rare messenger who passed through the village. The war had touched the community in small ways, in taxes and shortages and the general unease that hung over the countryside, but it had not touched the garden. The garden knew nothing of war, knew only the turning of the seasons and the patient work of roots and soil and the slow green pulse of life that moved beneath the surface of things. The garden was a place apart, a small enclosed world where the only conflict was the struggle of a plant to reach the light or the competition between roots for water and nourishment. And even those struggles were gentle and slow and resolved themselves without violence or anger. Sister Clémence was grateful for the garden's indifference to the affairs of the wider world, and she sat within its walls and let her mind rest in the quiet space that the garden provided. The cold finally became too much to ignore, a deep, insistent ache in her bones that could not be wished away or accepted any longer. She rose from the bench slowly, her body stiff and reluctant, and she stamped her feet gently to encourage the blood to return to her numb toes. The garden lay before her in the fading light, the raised beds and the wattle edging and the stone walls all holding their familiar shapes under their covering of white. Nothing had changed since she had sat down, nothing had moved or grown or altered in any visible way, and yet something had shifted nonetheless. The thinking was done. The mental walk through the garden of the coming spring was complete, and she felt the same quiet satisfaction she always felt after spending time in the presence of the sleeping plants. She turned away from the bench and began the slow walk back toward the gate, her footsteps leaving a line of dark holes in the crusted snow. The path was the same path she had walked 100 times that winter, the same path she would walk 100 times more before the snow finally melted and the bare earth was revealed. The gate was cold iron and heavy oak, and she pushed it open and stepped through into the dark passage that led back to the cloister and the infirmary and the warm, drowsy air of the room where her patients waited. Behind her, the garden settled back into its white silence, the roots of the comfrey and the betony and the lavender holding fast in the frozen earth, waiting with the same patient endurance that Sister Clémence had learned over 23 winters. The light continued to fade, the shadows continued to lengthen, and somewhere deep beneath the snow, in the dark, still soil where the frost could not reach, the first faint stirrings of the spring to come were already beginning, so small and so slow that no human sense could detect them. But they were there, as they had always been and always would be, and Sister Clémence carried the knowledge of them with her as she walked back into the warmth and the quiet and the slow, steady rhythm of the winter night.